Welcome, everyone, to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller. I represent Secretary Monica Tibbetts-Nutt here. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. You can read the full notice for your rights and protections at www.bostron.org/MPO_NON_DISCRIMINATION. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Priyanka Chapekar of the MPO staff at pchapekar@ctps.org or 857-702-3661 or via the chat box. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Please call the roll.
Yes, MassDOT seat 1.
Yes, David Moeller, I'm here.
Thank you. MassDOT seat 2. After that, MassDOT Highway Division.
MassDOT Highway, John Romano here.
Morning, John. MBTA.
Josh Ostroff, representing MBTA General Manager Philip Eng and the MBTA.
Welcome. Regional Transportation Authorities, Metro West Transit Authority.
This is Tyler Tarasi representing Administrator Jim Nee of the Metro West Regional Transit Authority, present.
Hi, Tyler. Next is Massport.
Good morning. This is Sarah Lee from Massport.
Good morning, Sarah. Next, MAPC.
Julia Waller, MAPC, representing for Eric Graffa and Mark Drayson. I'm using my phone for audio, by the way. I'm muting here.
Noted. Hi, Julia. Next, MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning. Hannah Swilikowski, MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning. Advisory Council. And also recognizing, checking chat here, recognizing John Bouchard as present as well.
I'm present. I got my audio working. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. City of Boston, seat 1.
Jen Rowe, representing Mayor Michelle Wu in the City of Boston.
Thank you. City of Boston, seat 2.
Jessica Morris, filling in for Nayeli Rodriguez for City of Boston.
Welcome, Jessica. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Motti, representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
Hi, Jay. At-large City of Newton.
Good morning, David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Good morning, David. At-large Town of Arlington.
This is John Alessi, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy and the Town of Arlington.
Morning, John. At-large Town of Brookline. Next is Intercore Committee, City of Somerville, please.
Good morning, Tom Bent, representing Mayor Katiana Ballantyne, City of Somerville in the Intercore.
Good morning, Tom. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Good morning, Kristen Guichard representing Acton Select Board Member Fran Arsenal for the Magic Subregion.
Good morning, Kristen. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, representing Metro West, and Mayor Charles Siskiyou of Framingham.
Hello, Dennis. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly. Do we have Beverly? Next is North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington. Followed by South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Rentham. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Good morning, Tom. Welcome. I'm going to call on our federal partners, Federal Highway Administration. And then finally, do we have representation from the Federal Transit Administration today? Understood. With that calls the roll. Back to you, Mr. Chair, and thank you.
Thank you. Next item is the chair's report. I've been asked to just talk today again about the federal process and changes that have occurred and are occurring with the new administration. So many of you may have seen an email notification that went around that all TIP amendments were being required to go from the region to the central office at USDOT General Counsel for review prior to finalization. So that announcement came out a week and a half ago. It has since been rescinded. So TIP amendments are going through their normal process. There is no additional delay. They do not have to go to USDOT headquarters for review. Discretionary projects that have been awarded but have not yet proceeded to contract, grant agreement, are not currently being processed. So they're all sort of on hold. None of them have been canceled, but they're not moving from award to contract yet. Funding, reimbursements, we are getting all of our reimbursements. As we pay our bills, our federal partners continue to give us the 80% share. Obligations and contract and advertisements are still proceeding as they always have. But this is, we're in a state of flux. A lot of things are happening. That's what I know today. I'm happy to take questions. Happy to have any discussion anybody wants to have. Also happy to continue to update the MPO as things develop. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. You mentioned some of the projects are on hold. Does that represent a large number of projects, or you don't have to go through them, but like just what type of scope is that?
Yeah, so it's a little hard for me to, ultimately I could figure this out by going to a spreadsheet. There's quite a few. Some of them are local, some of them are regional, some of them aren't MassDOT projects, right? So if even the MPO, for example, got an award for, say, Safe Streets for All, that has not yet been proceeded to a grant agreement. That grant agreement is currently on hold. We got an award recently for McGrath Boulevard. MassDOT got an award. That award is currently on hold. It's not anything specific about any of those projects. From what I can tell, currently there's a pause on moving any project from award to agreement.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Seeing none, like I said, if you want another update, certainly feel free to reach out to Tegan or to me directly. And if something happens that I feel like is worthy of an update, I'll update whether anybody's asked or not. Next item on the agenda is Executive Director's Report. Tegan?
Thank you, David, and hello and welcome everybody, board members and members of the public. I'm Tegan Tyke. I'm the Executive Director of the staff to the Boston Region MPO. Next slide, please. So for the Executive Director's report, I'm going to cover a number of items. I have a brief announcement. I'll cover a couple of staffing updates. I'll spend a few minutes to give an overview of the TIP development timeline, just to sort of try to clarify what's coming up in the next couple of months in this particular area of focus for the board and the public. And then I'll cover today's agenda, which is certainly a bit dense, and I'll try to give you an overview of what we'll be covering today and then highlight the next meetings coming up. Next slide. So first, I wanted to make an announcement that a survey was shared with board members recently asking for your feedback about the MPO ongoing work, as well as ideas for discrete studies. And that's to help us develop our upcoming Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. That's the annual work plan. Excuse me, recovering from an illness, for the MPO. The survey is actually closing today. So if you would like to submit a response, board members who received that survey, please do so by the end of the day today. The contact for the survey, as well as for the UPWP in general, is Olivia Sakosha, OSACCOCIA at ctps.org. So please reach out if you have any questions. Next slide, please. So next I have both a happy and a sad staff update for you all. Next slide, please. First, I'm happy to announce that we have filled the position of the manager of the Multimodal Planning and Design Group. Jen Kaplan will be joining us on Monday, this coming Monday, March 10th, and we'll look forward to introducing her to the board when she arrives. On a sad note, we will be saying goodbye to Casey Cooper, who is the manager of our bicycle and pedestrian program, with her last working day being this coming Tuesday, March 11th. Casey joined us almost 10 years ago now and has brought her passion as well as her skills to help improve the safety and comfort for people walking, biking, and rolling in the Boston region. And most recently, she's been instrumental in standing up our new bicycle and pedestrian steering committee, which will continue after she departs. But I just want to say that if you have worked with her at all, you will know that beyond her technical skills, she brings enthusiasm and really a brightness to every aspect of her work that she does for the MPO, and we will miss her. So please thank Casey for her contributions. Next slide, please. Okay, so next I'd like to spend a few minutes giving you an update on the timeline for the development of the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP, the TIP being the Rolling Capital Investment Plan. And this will probably be the most time-intensive activity for the coming couple of months, but also not the only focus of the board. So while I'm summarizing what's coming up for the TIP development, please keep in mind that there's other business that we're going to continue to conduct in the meantime, like amendments to the current federal fiscal year 25 to 29 TIP, approval of work scopes, discussions of work that's been completed, and of course, also we're in the season of developing the UPWP for FFY26, the survey for which I just mentioned. But let me focus for now on how you're going to be engaged in the TIP development over the next 4 months. And I hope what this will do is clarify a bit board members' roles and how the public can participate in this process in the coming months. But if it is confusing, please, I welcome any questions or feedback if more clarity is needed. Excuse me, next slide, please. So first in March, I want to note that there'll be TIP discussions, the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP development discussions on all 4 Thursdays of this month, starting with today. On the Thursdays that we do not have a board meeting, there will be a TIP process engagement and readiness committee meeting where the conversations will continue. And so you all are also invited to attend those meetings as well. But for today, on March 6th, we'll be discussing scoring for new projects that applied through the MPO's process for funding. And then we'll also talk a bit about our efforts to rescore existing projects that were carried over from the 25 to 29 TIP into this TIP that were scored under the prior scoring system. So Ethan will talk about that today as part of the agenda. And then next week on the 13th, the TIP committee will meet to start discussing programming scenarios for the 26 to 30 TIP, including changes to the already programmed projects, as well as an opportunity to fund and program in new projects that have been scored. So just as a reminder, the programming scenarios being discussed in these forums are focused on the subset of the projects included in the TIP that the MPO is given discretion over soliciting, scoring, and selecting. But the tip in its entirety that you will approve this year includes all proposed federally funded projects by MassDOT, the MBTA, and the regional transit authorities. That's Metro West and Cape Ann. So at that committee meeting, you're also going to discuss further the scoring process for the pre-existing projects and sort of constraints that we're facing in that. At the next board meeting on the 20th, we're going to explore those initial programming scenarios at the full board meeting, which will be informed by the TIP committee discussion that happened the prior week. And in addition, we expect to hear from the regional transit authorities, again, Metro West and CADA, to present on their overall capital investment plans, which is the full set of investments to be included in the TIP. And then the last Thursday of the month, the TIP committee will meet again, and they will focus on discussing revisions to those programming scenarios. Next slide, please. In April, we will have the 2 board meetings that are pre-scheduled on the 3rd and the 17th, and those will be focused on finalizing a programming scenario for the 26 to 30 TIP, and then voting to release the draft 26 to 30 TIP for public review and comment. And in April, we should also expect for the MBTA and MassDOT to present on their larger capital plans, with the dates for those presentations being finalized. And the next slide for May. May is a bit more tentative depending on how the process goes, but the focus for the month will be on collecting and processing public comments related to the draft 26 to 30 TIP that will have been released in May. And in the meantime, on May 15th, the second Thursday of the month at the MPO meeting, we will have a quarterly readiness update discussion. And these are called for in the MPO's operations plan to increase transparency and project progress, and to help give the staff and the board more advance notice as to potential changes into the TIP as a result of progress changes in terms of TIP projects. So this is the first year that we're fully implementing the quarterly update structure that's talked about in the operations plan. And so these May updates could inform additional project changes between when the draft TIP goes out for public comment on April 17th and when the board expects to endorse the TIP in early June. So we will have that discussion when we come to that in May. And then we also expect to have a TIP committee meeting on May 22nd, where we'll continue to discuss both public comments on the TIP as well as any additional changes to the draft federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP. And the next slide. And then finally, in June, on June 5th, the first Thursday of the month, we'll expect for the board to meet to review the public comments and then vote to endorse the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP. So that's the overall timeline. Next slide, please. Now we'll get back to today's agenda, which is quite dense. Next slide, please. So in addition to our usual sort of standing items, we will have first an action item for a scope of work. That's a UPWP discrete study endorsed by the UPWP committee and the board for this federal fiscal year. And being a small, discrete effort, we're planning to analyze a conceptual roadway pricing scenario for its impacts, not to promote a specific scenario, but to explore the tools that we have and their ability to answer the kinds of questions related to potential roadway pricing scenarios. So we're hoping for this to set the stage for future work if the board wishes to continue to explore this topic. And we'll look forward to a presentation from Joe DeLorto on that work scope. Next, there will be an action item that is sort of the second part of setting transit performance targets, which are required to be set by NPOs and RTAs each year. So Sam Taylor, of MPO staff, along with Angela Cervello of MBTA, will be giving you a presentation and request you to take action to endorse transit asset management targets. Then we'll have 2 amendments. Note that the amendments for today, 9 and 10, are for the current federal fiscal year 25 to 29 TIP, not the TIP in development. And so first will be to endorse Amendment 9 after a public comment period. And then the second will be to discuss a new Amendment 10, which will be to program funding that would become unallocated following delays of projects out of the current federal fiscal year 2025. So this amendment is time sensitive, and we're asking you to consider taking action today so that it can be endorsed in April before the federal deadlines for the obligation of the federal fiscal year 2025 funds. Then Aaron McGuire will kick us off on a long process, but a very, very intensive process over the next few years for the MPO's long-range transportation plan, which is set to be endorsed in the summer of 27. She'll talk about feedback we received from developing the last plan and some new approaches we're talking about piloting for this next plan. Then next, there'll be a presentation on the results of a discrete UPWP study approved in last federal fiscal year, which explores the feasibility of using a tool called Conveil to address the impacts that TIP projects can have on destination access for possible use in TIP scoring. So Betsy Harvey will discuss the results of that exploration and recommendations moving forward. And then we'll have our 26 to 30 TIP project scoring presentation by Ethan Lapointe that I already mentioned. He'll summarize the new project scores as well as discuss constraints in rescoring existing projects. And then finally, we'll have a summary of the federal fiscal year 2024 public engagement activities, where Stella Jordan will discuss how we've evaluated the effectiveness of that public engagement and how we plan to address gaps in the coming federal fiscal year. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I just want to highlight those next two upcoming meetings. I already discussed some of the content of those on March 20th and April 3rd. Both of those will be held as in-person meetings at 10 Park Plaza. We'll send more details. There will be a hybrid option to participate, but just as a reminder, we've heard from board members that you find it sort of more productive and a bit more easy to engage in the TIP scenario conversations in person, since there's a lot of information and discussion that goes into those particular topics. So please keep an eye out for more details about those meetings, as well as for more details about committee meetings, not only for the TIP, but also for the administration and finance and the UPWP committees in the coming month or so. And that, Mr. Chair, is it. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Questions for Tegan? So Tegan, I have a quick one on the slide that's up right now. Public record exemption from open meeting law, exemption from open meeting law. When does that expire?
At the end of the month. So we are planning for holding in-person meetings going forward in April, in hopes that we will hear that we will be able to continue to cover hybrid meetings and virtual meetings after April 3rd.
But so as of now, then, the April 3rd meeting, in order to actually occur, there has to be a quorum in the room. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So it's really, even though it's hybrid, and I know everybody likes to attend these, it's really important that a majority of the MPO attend if you possibly can, because otherwise we'd have to cancel the meeting.
Thank you, David, for that clarification. Very important.
Thank you, Tegan. Next up is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Brad Rawson.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Board. I just wanted to say a quick public thank you to you, David, and to the entire Mass DOT team for working hard to provide accurate and timely information for municipalities and regional partners. I really appreciated that that Chair's report, and I know how difficult and how fluid the scenarios are as you're describing. Quick little shout out. Thank you, Casey, for 10 years of service. You're leaving us better than you found us. But the real thing I wanted to say, Chair, is a statement of support, gratitude, and solidarity for all of our partners in FHWA and FTA. This has got to be a really hard, really turbulent, and honestly denigrating and insulting period to be in federal service. And I think it's important for MPO members and partners to state publicly for the record that we as a region, we as communities, we as human beings benefit from and value the individual human beings serving at places like FHWA, FTA, and many other federal agencies. So thank you, Ken, and thank you everybody who's been involved over the years. We've got your back as best we can.
Thank you, Brett. Megan McNamara.
Hi, thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Megan McNamara. I'm the Assistant Planning Director for the town of Lexington. I know most of you are familiar with my predecessor, Sheila Page, who she very sadly left Lexington back in October and was very excited to join the town of Wellesley. But I just wanted to reach out and introduce myself and really thank the MPO staff and the MPO board. This will be my first TIP season going through the process. So I really appreciate both Ethan Lapointe's patience and the MPO staff's assistance through all the process. We have a lot of exciting things happening in Lexington right now. Everyone in town, and I mean everyone in town, is gearing up for the 250th celebration. We're designing a brand new high school. We're seeing a lot of dense multifamily and mixed use developments in town. So it would only seem fitting that we also submit a complete streets project for the Bedford and Hartwell Avenue corridor. So as we progress through this, if anyone has any comments or questions on the project, I'm sure there are, please reach out. I can direct you with any member of our project team, as well as our consultant VHB for the project. So thank you all. I'll keep it brief and appreciate all your work.
Thank you, Megan. Looking forward to working with you. It's nice to meet you. Any other public comments at this time? Seeing none, if you have a comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will try to call on you. Next up is the committee's chair's report. Are there any? Chris Clem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. This is Chris Clem from MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. The UPWP committee is expected to meet several times during the month of April, the first of which is expected on April 3rd. At that meeting, we'll discuss the list of feasible study proposals that were submitted through the UPWP surveys, and we'll also discuss the MPO's ongoing work programs. If needed, we will have another meeting the following Thursday, April 10th, for a continued discussion on the MPO's program work. And finally, we'll have a meeting on April 17th, following an MPO board meeting to discuss the final study scenarios. And staff will be posting more details on those meetings to the MPO calendar in the coming weeks. That is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Jen Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Executive Director previewed the TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee is going to meet next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. We'll dive in deeper to the project rescoring than what today's very packed agenda allows, and we'll discuss several initial programming scenarios. And we expect the agenda to be emailed out later this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Any questions for either Chris or Jen? Seeing none. Next item is the approval of the minutes of January 16th. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Jen Rowe.
Motion to approve the meeting minutes for January.
Thank you. Is there a second? Tom Bent.
Mr. Chair, I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Thank you. We'll begin with David Muller.
Yes.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Josh Ostroff.
Josh Ostroff, yes.
Tyler Tarasi.
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Sarah Lee.
Sarah Lee, yes.
Julia Wallers. I will return. Hannah Switlikowski.
Sorry,
wasn't allowed.
Switlikowski,
I'm not
yes.
allowed to unmute on my. Well, I'm using my phone. If you could give me permission there, but Julia Wallers, yes.
Roger. I will count, acknowledge both. I just want to see if Hannah Switlikowski, was that a yes or
Yes.
response?
Yes,
you
thank
both.
you.
I am Jen Rowe.
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jessica Morris.
Jessica Morris, yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis.
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi.
John Alessi, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
At this point, also acknowledging Len Diggins.
Yes.
I'll just find here. Thank you. Give me a moment, please. Perfect. And next is Kristen Guichard.
Kristen Guichard, yes.
Dennis Giambetti.
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Are there any other board members who would be who would want to be acknowledged for this vote?
Yes.
That I have missed?
Darlene Nguyen, North Shore Task Force.
Thank you, Darlene. We'll record that. Are there others? Just doing a count. This motion carries, and they're returning the mic to Mr. Chair. Thank you. Do we still have the chair, David, online? may be a technical difficulty. We will wait for a moment, and if not, is the protocol to then go to a vice chair role?
We could move to the vice chair.
I'm
If
back.
Julia's prepared.
I'm
Oh, he's back. Good.
It dropped, but it let me back in without me having to do anything, so I'm back. I assume
Welcome back, David.
that those minute meetings passed, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Yes.
Next item on the agenda is a work scope for roadway pricing. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe DeLordo, and I'm a data analyst on the MPO's Project Analysis and Applications team. Today, I'd like to present the scope of work for the UPWP study titled Roadway Pricing, Balancing the Need for a Transition to Sustainable Mobility with Equity Considerations. This project has a budget of $50,000 and is funded as a UPWP MPO-funded discrete study for federal fiscal year 2025. The work is scheduled to be complete within 6 months of the project commencement. The work completed through this study will address the MPO's LRTP goal areas of equity, mobility and reliability, and clean air and healthy communities. This work builds on a discrete study from federal fiscal year 2023, Learning from Roadway Pricing Experiences, that explored best practices in roadway pricing and identified challenges and opportunities across a few selected case studies. In this study, staff will begin exploring a conceptual roadway pricing scenario applied to the Boston region for its potential congestion, revenue, and equity impacts. The objective of this study is to understand the potential impact of a roadway pricing scenario on congestion and revenue and the populations that will be affected. The conceptual framework used for the study can serve as a starting point for informed stakeholder engagement on potential impacts and trade-offs of roadway pricing scenarios, and will allow staff to familiarize the tools and data available for further research into the impacts of roadway pricing in Greater Boston. During Task 1, we will review existing research and literature on roadway pricing programs. In Task 2, we will identify potential roadway pricing strategies, review each strategy's applicability to the Boston region, and identify what data is available to support each analysis. With stakeholder input, including from the MPO's Congestion Management Process Committee, we will select one scenario that we will model and evaluate in Task 3. This analysis will provide a high-level understanding of the scenario's potential impact on congestion, revenues, and people in the Boston region. The final products of this study will be a white paper describing the work completed and a 2-page brief with key findings. Our findings will also be presented to this board. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you, Joe. Questions for Joe? Ben Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mainly a comment. I mean, I'm really happy to see the study. And I'm happy for the focus on equity considerations. In fact, I would say equity priority, because I think what's important is for whatever we come up with to not be regressive. But this has lots of possibilities. I'm glad that you leave it as open as you have, and I'm also happy that you'll be coming, to the CMP committee to discuss it more, especially before you decide on a scenario. So I'm going to be very happy to support this. And quickly, I just want to also say that I support what Brad Rawson said wholeheartedly. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Lynn. Josh Ostroff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Joe, could you talk a little bit about who the stakeholders are?
As far as the stakeholder engagement for
Yeah, I should say, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't see, this is not like public outreach, right? So this is really more, I mean, I'm just curious to know how deeply do you envision going?
Yeah, so we identified the CMP committee just because the data that we're thinking of going to them with is going to be quite technical as far as like the data that's available to support each analysis, each of the scenarios, the sort of pros and cons of each scenario from a data availability and methodology feasibility perspective. So we identified the committee for the most appropriate venue for that kind of discussion. But certainly if there are other MPO committees who'd like to provide their input on that work, we'd be happy to consider that as well. But that was the sort of extent of the outreach of the stakeholder engagement that we envisioned for that particular part of the study.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jen Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Joe, for presenting the thoughtful work scope. And appreciate Tegan and David Hung answering some questions I had about it earlier this week. I can really see a clear through line between how this scope is taking on three of the four lessons that were really highlighted in the MPO's review earlier body of work of roadway pricing programs. As Len mentioned, the need to reduce the burden on low-income communities, ensuring that policies are aggressive enough to really see impacts, and then this need to continuously evaluate for improvement. So making sure we have kind of the tools and methodology to do that. There was one lesson that was highlighted in the kind of overview of that previous body of work, that was the need to really build buy-in and have robust community engagement, which kind of plays off of what Josh was just bringing up too. And so I was curious if there's opportunities in staff's kind of ongoing programs to perhaps address that fourth lesson in this upcoming fiscal year.
If
I think,
yeah,
Joe, I think Tegan will take this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that, Jen. And I think that's also really excellent feedback into the development of the next UPWP. At this point in time, we have this sort of discrete chunk of funds associated with this particular study, but we've been continuing to think about and explore what sort of broader stakeholder engagement could look like if we do continue this work. So it's not necessarily discretely funded through our work plan, but I think that's something that if we can hear from board members your continued interest in funding that work, we can work to incorporate it into the work plan.
Can I ask a question? So the purpose of this work scope isn't actually to choose an alternative, correct? Right? We're just trying to figure out whether the MPO has the tools it needs to actually do this work and do it effectively. Is it like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Joe, but can you help me here?
Yeah, I think like Tegan mentioned, it's a lot about familiarizing the data and the sort of analytical tools that we have available to do these kind of analyses, and to select a scenario where we can get as good of a look as possible at the congestion, revenue, equity impacts of whatever that program is. So there's like if you look back to the task force report, they looked at roadway pricing mechanisms like increased tolling or VMT fees, or like a New York style cordon congestion pricing program. So as far as, we're not recommending or endorsing any particular strategy as sort of what the region should do, what we should pursue from a policy perspective, but it's more on the technical side of what is our capacity to do this kind of analysis and to do a first real check of that.
Thank you, Joe. Other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve this work scope as presented today? Please state your name for the record. Lynn Diggins.
Leonard Diggins makes a motion to approve the work scope.
In row.
I will second that motion.
Please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Josh Ostroff,
Josh Ostroff, yes.
Tyler Tarasi,
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Julia Wallers,
Julia Wallers, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Swilakowski, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jessica Morris,
Jessica Morris, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Kristen Guichard,
Kristen Guichard, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Is there any board member that I have not yet called for the vote? Motion carries. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is an action item on transit asset management performance targets. Sam Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Taylor, and I am the Program Manager of Performance-Based Planning and Programming. And I am here along with Angela Cervello, the Deputy Director of Capital Strategy at MBTA, to present to you the Boston Region 2025 Transit Asset Management Performance Targets. And before I begin, I would like to thank MBTA, Cape Ann Transportation Authority, and the Metro West Transit Authority for their coordination over the past couple months on performance target setting efforts. Next slide, please. So here's a brief overview of what we will cover today. I will give a short explanation on how the transit asset performance targets fit into the performance-based planning and programming process. And before showing the data on how past and proposed performance targets for each of the three agencies, I will lay out the federal transit asset management performance requirements. Then Angela Cervello from MBTA will present MBTA's transit asset management targets. After that, I will present targets for CADA and MWRTA. And then I will share a bit on the connections between these targets and opportunities for improvement through MPO programming. And then we will request that the board take a vote on today's proposed performance targets. Next slide, please. So this slide, which many of you have seen and heard at recent MPO meetings, shows the federally required performance target areas. Targets on transit assets are required to be adopted annually. Last month, the board adopted annual targets on both roadway and transit safety. And not in 2025, but in future years, we will address bridge and pavement condition, travel time reliability, and congestion mitigation and air quality. Next slide, please. So the target setting process for transit asset management is as follows. The U.S. Department of Transportation establishes requirements for MPOs and RTAs as part of its Transit Asset Management Final Rule. Transit agencies set targets for their relevant assets, and MPOs work with those transit assets on setting their targets and establishing regional targets. Next slide, please. So there are four categories of transit asset performance measures on which targets are set. The first is rolling stock, which are public transit vehicles taken by the public, such as buses, trains, and ferries. And that's the first category. Rolling stock is an age-based measure and is measured as the percentage of vehicles that have met or exceeded their useful life benchmark, or ULB. I'd like to note that it's very common for vehicles to surpass the age limit that's recommended by the FTA, but the more vehicles that surpass their ULB, the higher the percentage. So to be clear, agencies are aiming for lower percentages in this category. The second category is equipment or non-revenue vehicles. This category involves assets like service trucks and maintenance vehicles that are not taken by the general public. Equipment is also measured as a percentage of vehicles having exceeded their ULB. The third category is facilities, and this condition-based category is measured on the FTA's term scale, or Transit Economic Requirements Model scale. This is a 5-point scale, and facilities must receive a 3.0 or greater to be considered adequate. And the official measure for the facilities category is the percentage of assets with a condition rating below 3.0 on the term scale. And the last asset category is fixed guideway infrastructure. This category only applies to MBTA since it is the only agency with applicable track. This is a performance-based measure. And it's the percentage of track segments with performance or really speed restrictions. And as with all other categories, agencies are aiming for lower percentages in this category. Next slide, please. So a few more notes before we get into the targets themselves. The FTA requires that transit agencies produce transit asset management plans that address asset conditions every 4 years. However, transit asset management targets must be adopted annually, and those are written as part of annual narratives that transit agencies submit to the National Transit Database, or NTD. And using this guidance, MPOs consider RTA targets and set targets for their regions. And while MPOs and transit agencies are required to set targets, FTA does not impose penalties for the failure to meet those targets. And now, for the next handful of slides, I will pass it over to Angela Cervello of MBTA.
All right. Hello. Nice to be back again. I'm Angela Cervello Jones, Deputy Director of Capital Strategy at the MBTA. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to be presenting or walking through the MBTA's TAM performance measures and targets. To reiterate, there are 4 asset categories that we're going to go through today, but I do just want to acknowledge that the MBTA has a really diverse and complex asset inventory that includes more than just these 4 asset categories. We continue to work to build a robust asset management program, and this presentation today is an FTA reporting requirement and is also just one small component of transit asset management at the MBTA. So with that, we'll get right into it. Starting with rolling stock, this asset category refers to revenue vehicles that provide passenger service to customers. So this includes buses, rail cars, locomotives, ferry boats, and paratransit vans and automobiles. The performance measure for this asset category uses age as a proxy for state of good repair and is focused on the percentage of revenue vehicles that have reached or exceeded that useful life benchmark, or ULB. So a lower measure indicates better fleet condition overall, and ideally we want those percentages to go down over time. The useful life benchmark estimates the expected life cycle of a fleet and is assigned based on vehicle type. It is generally FTA defined using standard default ULBs for each type of vehicle in our inventory. And I just want to call out that the age of a vehicle does not necessarily indicate its condition or its performance. There are older vehicles that perform quite well, even if they are beyond the useful life benchmark. So age is really just a proxy here. Next slide, please. So this table compares our fiscal year 23 and 24 actuals and also is showing you the targets that we have set for fiscal year 25. This measure is reported to the FTA at the vehicle type level. So that's that second column in the table. That's the level that we are reporting it to the FTA. As you can see, we tend to hover around 21 or 22% of our revenue vehicles being beyond the ULB, but I'll highlight some notable items here. For standard buses, our performance has continued to improve due to the delivery and acceptance of new vehicles in the fleet, and we expect that to continue as we get new bus fleets on board. We are also anticipating improvement in the commuter rail coach category due to the procurement of the new Hyundai Rotem coaches. All 83 new coaches are expected to enter the active inventory in this fiscal year. For heavy rail, the metric improved from fiscal year 23 to 24 because we were able to put more of the CRRC red and orange line cars into service. However, there's a collection of red line cars from 1994 that will turn 31 years old this year and hit their useful life benchmark. So that is why you see the metric starting to jump up again. And it will continue to be this high until we are able to retire these older vehicles. For light rail, the percentage increased last year because some of our older vehicles hit their useful life benchmark. This will also remain level for several years until we can see the arrival of the new Type 10s to replace them. And then finally, looking at paratransit, as you can see, 2 years ago, we had no vehicles beyond the ULB, and now about a quarter of the fleet has hit the useful life benchmark in the last 2 years. These vehicles have a useful life benchmark of about 6 years, which is fairly short. And this is another instance where that benchmark is not necessarily representative of the actual performance of the fleet. There are other metrics that we use, like miles traveled, to determine how long a fleet is able to perform. So once we start replacing these vehicles, then that percentage will go down. But because of the short useful life and the miles they're currently traveling, that is why you're seeing this jump this year. Next slide, please. So moving into equipment, this asset category refers to non-revenue rubber tire or steel wheel vehicles that are serving in a support capacity. So this includes first response vehicles, tow trucks, spot tampers, crane cars, snow plows, things like that. Similar to rolling stock, the performance measure for this category is focused on the percentage of vehicles that have met or exceeded the useful life benchmark. And again, age does not necessarily determine actual performance. This is especially true for non-revenue vehicles. Much of this equipment is stored indoors and used pretty sporadically, so it can perform adequately even if it is well beyond that useful life benchmark. Think of things like snow plows that we may use maybe a few times a year and may be stored indoors. So they may not see a lot of action despite being quite old. And it may benefit us to hold on to them for longer. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see, we've been able to reduce the overall percentage of vehicles at or beyond the ULB pretty significantly, from 49% in fiscal year 23 to about 25% in fiscal year 24. Much of this progress has been made with steel wheel vehicles. We've been able to successfully retire some of our older steel wheel vehicles and are expecting that trend will continue. For automobiles, you can see that it's quite high and will continue to increase slightly this year. That's what we're anticipating. Many of these vehicles also have a fairly short useful life benchmark. And so as we work to procure new vehicles and retire the older ones, we should start to see this go down in the future, but that will be after fiscal year 25. And I think I give this caveat every year, but I just want to note that the retirement of support vehicles is a little odd because it's non-cyclical. So there's not a consistent rate of removal from our inventory in a given year. This is part of why sometimes this metric will suddenly increase and then stay high for a little while before finally coming down. Even if we have vehicles that we have targeted for retirement, it may take a little while for them to be removed from the inventory. And it sometimes makes it challenging to set these targets. Next slide, please. Okay. Next up is facilities. This category includes two major asset types. The first is passenger and parking facilities, which includes things like parking lots and surface light rail stops, in addition to what we commonly think of as facilities. Basically anything that our customers are directly interacting with. The other category encompasses our maintenance and administrative facilities, so any support facility that is not used by customers. This measure uses condition ratings to indicate state of good repair. The condition rating is a composite score based on an on-site assessment of multiple components of a facility and uses that 1 to 5 term scale that was mentioned earlier. And this measure focuses on the percentage of facility assets that are below a 3 on this scale, which would indicate either poor or marginal condition. Next slide, please. So per FTA guidance, each facility asset is assessed on a 4-year cycle. And what this means is that in any given year, only a subsection of the facility's inventory is eligible for an updated condition rating. So even though the MBTA is investing heavily in state of good repair and modernization improvements to our facilities' assets, many of these improvements are not reflected in the condition data until several years after a project is completed. So just want to make sure I acknowledge that. So as you can see, we are continuing to improve in this measure. This is due both to the level of investment in capital projects to improve our facilities and also our investment in inspection and rating. We're now kind of hitting our stride in going back to previously assessed assets, giving them updated condition ratings, and capturing some of the investments that we're making in conditions. So this is really good news. And setting the targets, we do take into consideration the list of assets that we are planning to assess during this fiscal year. And again, that means anything that could potentially receive an updated condition rating. But because of that long lead time that I had mentioned earlier between when we invest and when it shows up in the inventory, we try and stay pretty conservative with our targets. And this is why the target is level for this year. One thing I do want to note is that with the opening of South Coast Rail, Those passenger facilities will start to show up in the inventory and be counted in this number starting with next year's reporting process. Next slide, please. Okay, this last measure is infrastructure, and it focuses on the percentage of revenue track miles with speed restrictions as a proxy for condition. Speed restrictions are slow zones where the maximum permissible speed of a vehicle is set to a value below the full service speed. So these can be caused by a number of different things: track defects, signaling issues, construction zones, including construction zones for nearby work, not necessarily work happening on the track. But anything that would be a permanent restriction that's related to the track itself, curves in the track, bridges, grade crossings, anything like that is excluded from this analysis. So this is only, all this to say we're referring to temporary speed restrictions only. This measure is an average, so it uses a single data sample from each of the 12 months of the year. This is the methodology set by the FTA. So it's a little different than, I think, the speed restriction dashboard that many folks might be familiar with. There are a number of speed restriction resources out there that we've put out. And of course, we've made so much progress, particularly in the last couple of years on this front. So this analysis and that data all come from the same place, but the methodology is different. So when you're sort of rolling it up the way that we are here, the numbers can look quite different, but it all does come from the same underlying data. Next slide, please. Okay. Looking at this by mode, for commuter rail, performance has continued to improve. We generally tend to hover around 3.5% for commuter rail track, but we often will set the target at 4% to account for the slight fluctuation that we often see. And this is in collaboration with our railroad operations team and sort of an acknowledgement of Keolis speed restriction targets. The track mileage for commuter rail will also change next year with the opening of South Coast Rail, so that will also have an effect on the number when we come back to report this next year. On the transit side, our performance for fiscal year 24 reflected the significant number of speed restrictions that we had implemented across the system a couple of years back. And targets for fiscal year 25 were calculated based on our performance in the last quarter of fiscal year 24 and the first quarter of fiscal year 25. So based on speed restriction data for that 6-month period. Of course, we have made incredible progress on the rapid transit system toward improving the condition of track and eliminating slow zones. As I think we're all aware, we were able to reduce our slow zones to 0 in December 2024, which is really wonderful progress. These targets were set in October before that happened and were developed using that standard methodology that I had mentioned with that 6-month calculation. So it's based off of our performance at the time that we originally submitted it. Realistically, we should expect to see it even lower when we get this year's actuals come next fall. That concludes my portion of the presentation. I'll pass this back to Sam. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So now we'll move on to CADA and MWRTA's targets. So CADA and MWRTA have set rolling stock targets based on their vehicle types. As we have stated before, the desired direction for all these targets are decreasing values. So for buses, CADA has set a target of 18% of vehicles exceeding ULB, which is similar to their 2024 performance of 19%. For cutaway vehicles, CADA expects some dramatic improvements, as in 2024 they had 65%, but they're setting a target of 0% for 2025. And for MWRTA, they expect no change in their fleets for automobiles, staying at 100% of the autos exceeding ULB. And MWRTA expects a slight regression in cutaway vehicles with a 2024 performance value of 27% and a target of 29% in 2025. And for vans, MWRTA expects the entire fleet to once again stay under the ULB threshold, and so they have proposed a target of 0%. Next slide, please. CADA and MWRTA have also set targets for equipment. CADA expects great improvement in this measure thanks to a few new vehicles. In 2024, 100% of CADA's non-revenue equipment vehicles were passed through ULB, but they've set a target of 25% for 2025. And MWRTA has set a target of 40% of its non-revenue vehicles exceeding their ULB, which is equivalent to their 2024 performance figure. Next slide, please. CADA and MWRTA have each set targets for their facilities. Both agencies have one facility each, and both agencies have set a target of 0%, meaning that their facilities are expected to remain in adequate condition for a score of 3 out of 5 or greater on FTA's term scale. So no expected changes for facilities. Next slide, please. So to summarize for CADA and MWRTA, CADA expects improvement in 2025 in both types of its rolling stock vehicles. MWRTA expects a slight uptick in the aging of its cutaway vehicles, one of its 3 rolling stock types. CADA expects significant improvements in its non-revenue vehicle fleet, and MWRTA is expecting no change here. And both agencies expect their loan facility to remain in adequate condition for 2025. Next slide, please. So the state and MPO play a role in improving these transit assets and working towards meeting performance targets in the area. MassDOT's capital investment plan allocates federal dollars to programs that support asset improvement for transit agencies, and MassDOT considers asset improvements when scoring candidate projects for the CIP. Similarly, the MPO considers MBTA and RTA investments when they apply for inclusion in the federal fiscal year 26 to 30 TIP. And in the current TIP, the MPO has contributed to vehicle replacements for both CADA and MWRTA through the TIP's Transit Transformation Program. Next slide, please. And finally, MPO staff requests that the MPO board move to support the staff recommended set of fiscal year 2025 transit asset management performance targets. I'd be happy to take any questions you have after this, and I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions for Sam or Angela? Jen Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for this presentation. Especially want to thank Sam for reminding me of the MPO's performance dashboard last week, and then helping me kind of crosswalk a bit between that dashboard and the data that was in the memo. I was particularly interested, of course, in the track improvement program, knowing how much work went into that and how successful it was. And so it was great hearing from Angela too, how the actual progress, isn't fully showing up in these annual reporting measures, given just kind of the way that the measures, how they were taken and when. I also glad Angela brought up the MBTA's dashboard. I know on the city side, we really appreciated that, being able to kind of see the progress over time and kind of on a more granular day-to-day sort of way than these annual metrics are reported. It sort of allowed the public to see change as it was ongoing. And we were sort of hoping, now that we're entering this period of ongoing maintenance, that the dashboard would continue to be a way that folks could see like this positive story around, a track restriction coming up and then being addressed. So I was curious, I know that dashboard hasn't been updated since the end of the year, and was curious if there was a plan for how it would be used going forward. This would be a question for the team.
So, to be honest, it's a different team that handles that dashboard, that type of communication. So we can touch base with them and follow up with you. I'm not honestly sure, and I don't want to misspeak, but we can follow up over email.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve these targets as presented today? Please state your name for the record when making the motion. Jen Rowe.
Jen Rowe, and I will motion to approve these transit asset management targets.
Lynn Diggins.
Larry Diggins seconds, and thanks Sam and Angela for meeting with me and Brian and Hannah to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Josh Ostroff,
Josh Ostroff, yes.
Tyler Terassi,
Tyler Terassi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Julia Wallers,
Julia Wallers, yes.
Hannah Switlikowski,
Hannah Switlikowski, yes.
Glenn Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jessica Morris,
Jessica Morris, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Kristen Guichard,
Kristen Guichard, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
anyone that I have not called. With that, the motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is federal fiscal year 2025 to 2029 Transportation Improvement Program Amendment number 9. Ethan Lapointe.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ethan Lapointe. I'm Transportation Improvement Program Manager with MPO staff here. My first presentation here today is to present Amendment 9 to the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 TIP, which we'll be requesting an endorsement of after this brief presentation. If we can go on the next slide. Just to recap what was in Amendment 9, it includes changes to the federal fiscal years 2025 earmark discretionary program and also the transit program for that year. Within the earmark discretionary program, there were 3 Reconnected Communities pilot grant awards for the City of Boston, the City of Revere, and the MBTA. This is one of the awards for the MBTA through that grant round, and this award was for JFK UMass Station. Elsewhere in the earmark discretionary program, there was also the reprogramming of an earmark for the town of Wakefield for their Broadway Railroad at Grade Crossing Improvement Project. This was an earmark that was previously programmed in the federal fiscal years 2023 to 27 TIP for construction only. This reprogramming not only allocates some of the earmark for construction, but also a portion of that earmark for design as well. And there were also some funding adjustments for projects for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority. If we can go on the next slide, Amendment 9 as an amendment had a 21-day public comment period, which spanned from February 7th to February 28th. During this period, MPO staff received 2 letters of support, one from the MBTA Advisory Board, highlighting each of the Reconnected Communities grant awards that were incorporated in the amendment, and also the Cape Ann Transportation Authority's project, and Wakefield's Broadway grade crossing. And the Wakefield Town Council also provided a letter to express support for advancing their Broadway at grade crossing improvement project. The town also, in that letter, which is available on the MPO calendar, gave a little bit more detail as to exactly what kind of improvements are incorporated in this grade crossing project. With all of that, on the next slide, MPO staff are requesting that the board votes to endorse Amendment 9.
Thank you, Ethan. Any questions for Ethan? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to adopt this amendment as presented? Hannah Switlikowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we approve this as presented this morning. And thank you, Ethan, and everyone for their hard work.
Thank you. Tom Bent.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to second this motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Josh Ostroff,
Josh Ostroff, yes.
Tyler Terassi,
Tyler Terassi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Julia Wallers,
Julia Waller, yes.
Anna Switlikowski,
Anna Swilakowski, yes.
Len Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jessica Morris,
Jessica Morris, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Kristen Guichard,
Kristen Guichard, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
With that, this motion to endorse carries. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, I believe, is Amendment 10. Ethan LaPointe.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving on to the second amendment for today's presentation. This is Amendment 10, also to the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 tip. As Tegan mentioned earlier during the executive director's report, this amendment is different from other amendments that have been presented to this board recently, or rather the need for this amendment is a little bit different. If we can move on to the next slide, Amendment 10 is going to reflect some changes to 2 regional target roadway projects in the federal fiscal year's 2025 program that, as part of our development process for the federal fiscal years 2026 to 2030 tip, were flagged for delay into 2026 during the tip readiness days exercise. These 2 projects join one other project, which was already delayed through Amendment 1 into 2026, and with their delay would leave a very substantial unprogrammed balance of regional target funding in federal fiscal year 2025. Now, historically, when the 2026 and 30 tip or other development tips are under development, these kinds of unprogrammed balances are addressed through the programming scenario for that development tip. However, federal fiscal year 2025 is not within the window of the next tip, and therefore this unprogrammed funding balance must be allocated via tip amendment rather than a traditional tip programming scenario process. If we can go on to the next slide, just to kind of quantify and describe a little bit more what these project delays look like before I get into the projects themselves. Between these 3 projects, among some of the other changes identified during readiness days, like changes in cost estimates, indicate that there would be an unprogrammed balance of about $24.6 million approximately in federal fiscal year 2025. Now, MPO staff had worked this past fall with the MBTA Metro West Regional Transit Authority and Cape Ann Transportation Authority to identify projects that could potentially use an unprogrammed balance in federal fiscal year 2026. When this balance for federal fiscal year 2025 was identified, we then worked with those stakeholders again to determine which of those projects that were looking at 26 could actually go even sooner to 2025. This amendment programs some of those projects that were identified for fiscal 2025 eligibility, and fortunately, thanks to that proactive engagement with those partners, the majority of these new projects that would be incorporated via this tip amendment are also scored projects against the MPO's evaluation criteria. It is worth noting here that given the tight timing, which I will get to later in this presentation, this timing does not allow for much opportunity to discuss these projects or other projects not on this list, their scores, and how they compare to one another, which is usually something that is conducted for a programming scenario. Again, this is due to the time constraints of this amendment. Specifically, on the next slide, ideally, this kind of amendment to address the federal fiscal year's 2025 unprogrammed balance would be done as an amendment concurrent with the release of the draft federal fiscal year's 2026 to 30 tip in April, functionally releasing as an amendment at the same time as the draft tip and being endorsed as an amendment at the same time as the draft tip would be endorsed in June. However, for transit projects specifically, because these projects would be funded by flexing highway dollars to FTA transit funding, the Federal Transit Administration has a requirement that all flex funding requests for federal fiscal year 2025 be made prior to May. In order to ensure that this amendment could still have a 21-day public comment period for it, to make sure that MassDOT, Federal Highway, and FTA also have sufficient time to review not only this TIP action, but also the STIP action it may be coordinated within, this amendment will precede discussions on programming scenarios for the next TIP, scenarios which will only begin to take place at next week's TIP committee meeting on March 13th. By having the amendment released today for public comment, that 21-day comment period would conclude at a time where this amendment could be endorsed on April 3rd, which is the same day that the final TIP scenario program would be would coalesce. So with that, on the next slide, I'd just like to review the 3 projects that were flagged for delay from federal fiscal year 2025 to 26, 2 of which, listed here on this slide, are included in this amendment. The 2 projects in this amendment are the Medford Shared Use Path connection at the Route 28 in Wellington Underpass, which is slated for delay to federal fiscal year 2026, likely Q1 or Q2 of that year. It's currently in Q4 25. The second project is PBD's projected, I should say, for Q4 25 based on MPO staff's understanding of readiness as expressed by the city. Similar situation with PBD's multi-use path construction of the Independence Greenway at Interstate 95 and Route 1. This project also has a cost increase. Now, something I want to clarify here is that at the February 20th meeting where TIP readiness updates were presented, and this project for the PBD Independence Greenway was initially flagged, the readiness, or I should say the cost increase, was indicated to be more at about $22 million. This is a revision of that cost estimate, taking it down to $19.1 million of cost estimate. This is an increase on the project of $5.2 million, or 37%, all of which would be captured as a result of this project's delay to federal fiscal year 2026, resulting from utility coordination. Now, this Medford project and the Peabody project are the only 2 included in this amendment. The 3rd project on this list is included for the illustrative purposes anyways. Just as a reminder, this was the intersection reconstruction at Route 3 and Bedford Road and south of Bedford Street in Woburn. That project was already delayed by Amendment 1. So with that, on the next slide, I'll then go into the projects. There are 9 of them total in order of transit authority or transit provider that are proposed for utilizing this unprogrammed balance resulting from these 3 projects. The first is an additional funding request from the Cape Ann Transportation Authority for the Gloucester Facility Modernization Project, which the MPO is already funding in federal fiscal year 2025. This is due to some additional needs in their parking lot efforts to improve their vehicle lot, and also some needs for a culvert that connects the Cape Ann Transportation Facility's assets to Pond Street. In addition, there is also an existing line item on the TIP for federal fiscal year 2025, about $1.71 million, where the Cape Ann Transportation Authority is requesting additional funding of $1.8 million in 2025 to replace an additional 3 buses in their fleet that are past the end of their useful lives. This would take the budget in 25 from $1.71 million to $3.51 million. It's also worth noting there's another $750,000 programmed in federal fiscal year 26 for this line item. And the third and final project for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority, this is a new project proposed through this amendment, is the Automatic Passenger Counting, or APC, and Automatic Vehicle Location, or AVL, deployment effort, which would deploy systems and hardware to allow CADA to track the locations of their buses as they navigate their routes, and also better track and account for ridership. Between these 3 projects, this is a net increase of funding to the Cape Ann Transportation Authority using MPO regional target dollars of about $2.8 million, bringing the total budget for these 3 projects combined for CADA in 2025 to about $5.8 million. And again, just moving alphabetically here on the next slide, that takes us to 4 projects for the MBTA. Each of these 4 projects are new projects. The first being the Bus Priority and Accessibility Improvements Project, which focuses on locations flagged as part of the MBTA's Plan for Accessible Transit Infrastructure, or PATI process. This is a $1 million funding request for fiscal 25, which addresses a priority subsection of bus stops for enhancement through that PATI program. I'll also note that there is additional funding that the MBTA is requesting for PATI bus stop projects in federal fiscal year 2026, which will be addressed as part of scenario development for the 2630 tip. The catamaran overhaul project for the MBTA, which was previously allocated some funding from the ferryboat capital program via a tip amendment in a prior tip, is also requesting an additional $2.64 million of funding from the MPO to overhaul and procure spare parts for 2 vehicles within their catamaran ferry fleet. MBTA is also requesting $2.5 million to address a cost increase for the Natick Center commuter rail station accessibility improvements project, which installs 2 new elevators, accessible ramps, and new stairways to the station, while also creating additional multimodal connections into the Cochituate Rail Trail. I'd also note as well that the MPO is currently funding a project in federal fiscal year 2028 for the town of Natick, which also connects into this ongoing project by the MBTA. And the fourth and final project in this amendment for the MBTA is the Wellesley Square Commuter Rail Station Upgrades Project, a request for $5 million, which would create an accessible connection between the inbound and outbound platforms at Wellesley Square Commuter Rail Station. Between these 4 projects, this is a net increase of about $11.13 million to the MBTA. And on the next slide, last but not least, we have 2 projects for the Metro West Regional Transit Authority. These are technically both current projects. The first is the Metro West Regional Transit Authority Blandon Hub Accessible Redesign Project. The project is currently funded with $2.5 million of regional target funds for design only. This is at about $1.75 million in 2025 and an additional $750,000 in 26. As the project continues to move along in design, given the flexibility of federal transit funding, the Metro West Regional Transit Authority has requested that the MPO consider allocating $6 million to this project to support the eventual construction phase that this design of the accessibility improvements for their primary bus hub would lead to. Taking the current line item budget from $1.75 million of design funding only in 2025 to complement that with an additional $6 million of construction phase funding in 25. Similarly, the MPO is currently funding the Metro West Regional Transit Authority for the procurement of 3 compressed natural gas buses, or 29-foot buses, the first in the MWRTA's fleet for any larger scale buses of that type. The MWRTA is requesting that beyond these 3 buses, an additional 6 are procured, taking the budget from $1.98 million to $6.18 million, a net increase of $4.2 million for those 6 vehicles, and revising the total or scope of the project for a procurement of 9 vehicles total. Again, all of these are compressed natural gas vehicles, so low emission fleet. And between these 2 projects, that is a net increase of $10.2 million to projects for the MWRTA. Or I'm sorry, should I clarify that is, oh yes, that is a net increase of $10.2 million. That slide was just not updated properly. So I would like to note before we move further and kind of just summarize everything here. On the next slide, again, Amendment 10 is proposing the programming of 5 new transit projects in federal fiscal year 2025 and allocating additional resources to address potential scope changes or cost increases on 4 currently funded efforts. These 9 line items total amount to about $24.1 million of new transit funding. This is new transit funding beyond what the MPO has already programmed for other projects for CADA, the MBTA, and MWRTA. Should this amendment move forward, total MPO funding to transit projects in federal fiscal year 2025 would be at about $70.6 million, which is 55.2% of all regional target funding in that year. On the next slide, I'd also like to note, with regard to unprogrammed balances, should this amendment move forward, these changes, also taking into account other cost estimates and adjustments that MPO staff are already aware of for currently funded fiscal 25 projects, would leave about $464,996 as unprogrammed contingency through the remainder of federal fiscal year 2025. This unprogrammed contingency may address any cost variances on any of the 3 projects that are listed here on this screen, which are currently still waiting to advertise for bids. The first is the Arlington Stratton School Improvements Project in 2025. Worth noting that this project has seen a slight cost increase of $200,000. That $465 roughly $1,000 figure I just mentioned already takes this cost increase into account, and the project is currently going through plan specifications and estimates revision, so it's very far along in design, very close to the finish line, as it were. The other section of the PBD Independence Greenway extension is at approximately $8.27 million and is also at a plan specifications and estimate stage, though it is worth noting that it must attain a new plan specification and estimate stage given some of the utility issues that emerged over this past summer. And there is also the plan for the reconstruction of Route 38 Main Street in Wilmington at $37.5 million of cost estimate. This is a MassDOT proponent project that now also has both resurfacing and bridge elements, hence the relatively high budget for the line item. This project is at 100% design based on the latest project info update there. So again, these are the three projects that are still on the books and still need to advertise through the end of federal fiscal year 2025 that would potentially need to utilize this unprogrammed balance. So with all of that, on the next slide, MPO staff are requesting that the board votes to release Amendment 10 for a 21-day comment period, which would start Friday, March 7th, conclude March 28th, with an expected date to bring this back to the board on April 3rd, same day as final scenarios would be discussed for the next tip. With that, on the next slide, I'm not only happy to field any discussion, but I believe each of the project proponents for the transit projects may also be available here today to answer questions on them.
Jay Monty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to say thank you, Ethan and team, for juggling all this. It's never easy. But it's more of a comment than a question. This is sobering to me, right? That in 2025, they're all great projects, every single one of them. I'm always happy to support the transit projects. When you mentioned that 55% of FY25 is transit projects, and hey, that's great. I support transit, but that also says to me these are all projects that we filled in because other projects that we had previously programmed weren't ready, which means that fewer than half of the projects that we programmed for this year are ready for construction. And that to me is just a glaring problem. We're dealing with this. We talked about it last meeting. This is not sustainable, right? Like we can't do this. Going back to the original three, and I think it was the Route 1 project, the bike path of Route 1. I think there's something in Woburn. I'm forgetting the third one, but the issues seem to be utility coordination, permits. I guess I'm sort of wondering, so they need to be advertised in fourth quarter of 2025. Has every effort really been exhausted to solve the utility issues, to expedite the permits? I think this is one of the recurring issues that we keep seeing. And I want to make sure that these efforts are being taken by all parties to expedite and prioritize these issues because of this problem it's causing, that half of our projects aren't getting programmed and we're ending with this massive downstream problem. So, and I appreciate the transit proponents being here. I would like to hear from, the folks doing the utility coordination, the folks doing the permit, work on these projects. Has everything really been done to make these projects happen on time? And I'm sure the towns have a role to play here too. But this is really sobering, and it seems like this is going to keep happening to perhaps an even greater extent in future years. So it's a comment, it's not a question, but I wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Lynn?
Please, Mr. Chair, you were about to say something. I'm okay with waiting to hear what you say because it may make what I was going to say unnecessary, but
I doubt that, Lynn, but I'll go ahead and go first.
Sure.
Ethan, I've got two questions. So the FY25 projects that are being delayed, they're not in this amendment. They're just being removed from the tip in this amendment, and we'll address that in 26 when we do our tip development. Or does this amendment actually delay those projects into 26?
This amendment as was also conducted with Amendment 1, is solely removing them from fiscal 25. It is not reprogramming them in 26. That will be addressed in the development
Okay.
tip and already is reflected in the scenarios.
Okay. And then my second one is, how did staff choose which projects to put in this amendment? I'm assuming that the T has more than $11 million worth of need that they could have thrown into the mix. MWA might have more than 10 million. CADA might have more than their 2 million. How did staff make this decision? And I'm a little concerned that it's become a staff decision and not an MPO decision. And that's not intended as a dig at you or Tegan or the staff, Ethan. It's just, I'm a little worried about how this has happened.
No, and I appreciate that. As I said earlier in the presentation, we understand that the timing here, our preference would be that this could be discussed further. As far as the decision making, it was largely coordinating with, we met with the city of Medford, or I should say staff met with the city of Medford and the city of Peabody to discuss these projects first, to identify what the proponent's preference was for shifting. We then directly worked with the Cape Ann Transportation Authority and Metro West and the MBTA to identify not only what projects could move into 25, but also what projects potentially neatly complemented existing line items in federal fiscal year 2025. Those 4 projects, 2 each between Metro West and Cape Ann, that were already on the tip in order to facilitate the possibility of using this flex funding process, given the narrow timeline to address via the amendment. And the MBTA had also indicated priority projects for being addressed. The Natick Center project is one that is already underway. And as noted, the $1 million for Patty grant funding was a priority subsection. Lastly, the catamaran overhauls already have other funding allocated to them, so this was meant to close the gap. So this was largely the priorities that were expressed by the proponents for these transit projects, organized by staff to be packaged to address the unprogrammed balance to ensure that this would not be a use it or lose it situation functionally.
All right, so let me try to unpack that. So does that mean that the MBTA gave you a list of $11 million worth of projects?
They did not. The MBTA applied for a series of projects, which I'll actually be getting to in a later presentation here today, many of which are not included in this amendment.
Yes.
But they identified a smaller group of projects that could potentially be considered for this amendment. Not all of the projects that the MBTA had indicated for this amendment, or not the totality of the amount of funding they wanted, is represented here. In some cases, the funding programmed for these projects is less than the full request, because many of these requests were also scalable, as expressed by the project proponents, especially bus procurements or the bus stop projects, for example.
Okay, and again, I am not suggesting that the T should get all the money at all. Okay, I'm just trying to figure this. And so, like Metro West, we funded design of a facility in 25. That design is not going to be done, or it takes whatever time it takes, right? And yet we're funding construction at a figure of $6 million. Is that $6 million based on some level of design, or is that just, hey, we've got $6 million and we think MWRTA should have $6 million, and so therefore we're programming the construction of the facility, and they'll carry it as carryover until they actually get around to being able to construct it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the $6 million
Yeah, all of mine are, Ethan.
True.
I'm sorry, Ethan. Go ahead.
No, you're good. As far as that cost estimate, actually, the Blanton Hub project is an example of where for 25 only, the funding that is programmed there is a subsection of what the MWRTA believes the total cost estimate for the facility is. There is still funding in 26, which is subject to further board discussion, but the MWRTA's full request was $12 million, of which $6 million is only reflected here. So the MWRTA may be better equipped to speak to not only how that number was identified, but also how they plan to utilize the carryover of this funding potentially to deliver this project as they move forward to, I think, A&E, which I'm not entirely familiar with that terminology, but
yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm just, again, Ethan, I think you and all the 3 entities have done a wonderful job on this. I just, and I understand the timing. I just feel like these may be the right projects and probably are, but I'm a little concerned that we haven't actually had any discussion about them at the MPO meeting. Lynn?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ethan. That might unsober Jay's comments a little bit. So the increase in funding for transit. There was already funding for transit, right? You said, right? And so we added to that, but it's not an indication that 55% of the projects are late. Is it? It's a different figure, right? It's less than 55%, right?
So 55% of the funding tied to the projects are, I do not off the top of my head know exactly what percent of the 55 projects, or excuse me, the 2025 projects were delayed, though it is a similar figure between these 3 projects that are already delayed out of 25. And of course, we have discussed kind of how this is a part of a broader pattern of delays, both at the MPO meeting on February 20th, and we'll continue to have that discussion at TIP committee meetings this month.
And as David said, he of course brought up good issues. And I have things that I would like to say towards them, but it is a long meeting, and so rather than having a 4-hour MPO board meeting, we'll have a 4-hour TIPper meeting next week. Thank you.
Josh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To your insightful questions, I would just add first, I think the MPO has been well served by Ethan doing good outreach when anticipating the potential for delays, so that the MBTA staff and our capital program planning team, a couple of whom are on the call today, are able to look at the geography that's affected by the delays, so that we can, to the extent possible, try to address some of the regional equity concerns that I think go into the decision making, and then be very mindful of readiness. So projects that are like ready to go, like the Patty bus stops, we can have assurance that those will be constructed, as soon as funding is available or assured. So we really try to address the regional equity concerns, readiness, and then to be prepared. But we actually provided a long list of projects and had a lot of back and forth with Ethan and Adriana, and with our staff, just to make sure that we would provide what seems like a sensible list. Of course, it's the MPO's decision of how to do that. But I appreciate board members' concerns about the timeliness to really consider this, because it does feel relatively sudden in the scheme of things.
John Romano?
Ethan, just curious, there was absolutely no highway projects at all that are available?
That's a very good question. So we checked in ESTIP the highway projects within the Boston region that still had pending advertisement dates. I believe there's a resurfacing contract on Route 9 in Brookline and Newton that was one potential candidate. Many of the others were bridge projects, and it's also worth noting that the unprogrammed, well, this is probably a better question for folks in planning, and I would be happy to kind of turn it back there, but the color of money on these projects were predominantly active transportation or congestion mitigation projects, and may not be one-to-one matches for any bridge preservation or bridge rehabilitation line items still remaining in 25 in the statewide highway program. So the short answer is, as an immediate review of the projects in the statewide highway program for 25 that had not advertised, there were none that were immediately flagged for acceleration into 25 there. We are, as part of the development scenarios for the next TIP, also looking, however, at statewide highway projects for 2026. That's a discussion that we will be happy to continue at next week's TIP committee meeting as well.
Thank you, Ethan. Other questions for Ethan? Jen Rowe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. More of a comment. Just I think to kind of summarize, I think what we're seeing here, of course, is reflecting of trends that we've certainly been talking about at TIPper, the TIP committee meeting. I think, but on a large, clearly we have an issue with continued delays and the ripple effects that they have. I did want to kind of highlight and thank the TIP committee and MPO staff for doing, the kind of one bright light here is that we had asked for information on these potential fill-in projects from the transit agencies earlier than we would have normally as a result of kind of having a bit more proactive and anticipatory kind of approach. So that's I think has allowed their what Ethan was speaking and folks at the team were speaking to like how being able to choose projects that are more aligned with the MPO's priorities and reflect kind of a bit more what the previous distribution of funds were. But that being said, clearly there's still a lot of work for us to do in terms of this. We're having to kind of take the information we have and trust that staff and the T and the RTAs were giving us projects that relate to what we would want. So if definitely would encourage everyone to join the TIPR committee because we're going to continue working on these issues over the next few months.
Thank you, Jen. Other questions? Ethan, I've got one last one. You're comfortable that $494,000 is enough of a cushion for when we've got a $37 million project that hasn't advertised yet?
Yeah. As far as that cushion for 494, or I think it's actually less. It might be around 465.
Maybe? Yeah.
464,996. Very close. But that cushion, based on our current understanding of design estimates, given the projects are all at 100% design or later, we are fairly comfortable with as far as the proponent status on various remaining projects there as well.
Excellent.
I believe each of them had cost increases that were already addressed, not only in this scenario, in the case of the Arlington Stratton School project, but in development of the 25-29 tip when they hit 100% already.
Thank you, Ethan. Any other questions for Ethan? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to release this amendment for a 21-day? Oh, Tyler, do you have a question? You're going to make a motion for a 21-day public review process. Tyler, do you have a question or are you going to make the motion?
I was going to make the motion, but
That would be
also
great.
I just want to also reiterate that I know there were a couple questions raised. I will definitely get back to you, folks that are wanting to confirm our funding amount for the project. I'll respond to those through the chair, but I am also happy to make the motion to approve TIP Amendment 10 for our 21-day public comment period.
Thank you. Is there a second to release this amendment? Jen Rowe.
Second that motion.
Motion has been made and seconded. Please call the roll.
David Mullen,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Josh Ostroff,
Josh Ostroff, yes.
Tyler Tarasi,
Tyler Tarasi, yes.
Sarah Lee,
Sarah Lee, yes.
Julia Wallers,
Julie Wallers, yes.
Hannah Swilikowski,
Hannah Swilikowski, yes.
Glenn Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
Jen Rowe,
Jen Rowe, yes.
Jessica Morris,
Jessica Morris, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
John Alessi,
John Alessi, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Kristen Guichard,
Kristen Guichard, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
and then finally Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Next item on the agenda is the long-range transportation plan kickoff. Erin McGuire.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. I am excited to be here today to mark the official beginning of the MPO's next long-range planning development cycle. My name is Erin McGuire. I am leading the development of said long-range plan. If we could go forward to the next slide. Today's presentation is going to walk you through some background information on what the long range plan is. We often abbreviate that to be LRTP. Content from our current plan, Destination 2050, feedback that we received following the development of that plan, and then some new approaches that staff propose piloting for this development cycle. As Tegan had mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, this is a long multi-year process. We're going to be engaging in many conversations on many different topics, and I'm looking forward to all of them with you. If we could move to the next slide. As some foundational information, the long-range plan, which is referred to as a Metropolitan Transportation Plan in federal regulations, is a transportation plan that examines the transportation system of an urbanized region, looking out a minimum of 20 years into the future. The long-range plan describes the general outcomes that MPO work and our investments strive to achieve. We released our most recent plan, Destination 2050, in July of 2023, and it became effective in October of that year. And we're anticipating that its successor will be endorsed in the summer of 2027 and go into effect for federal fiscal year 2028. Our long-range planning efforts exist in ongoing conversations with many other long-range plans from our peer agencies throughout the region. This includes MassDOT's Beyond Mobility, MAPC's Metro Common, the MBTA's Program for Mass Transportation, in addition to the MWRTA and CADA's Comprehensive Transit Plans, just to name a few. And again, this document outlines the general vision for our transportation system, along with several goal areas that are associated with this vision. And really fundamentally, it guides the general work and outcomes that MPO staff will pursue over the coming years. Next slide. So Destination 2050, our current plan, contains a wide variety of information. It documents the region's existing transportation system and assesses its associated needs through a needs assessment. It establishes a planning framework, which we refer to as our vision, goals, and objectives for the regional transportation system. This is developed through an extensive engagement process. Again, that will ultimately outline the outcomes that MPO work is striving to achieve. The plan establishes various investment programs to direct the MPO's regional target funding to projects throughout the region, which is then implemented in our TIP, which you're all well familiar with. The LRTP's financial plan allocates funds to these programs, along with some regionally significant major infrastructure projects that should be integrated into the plan's whole analyses. These analyses include air quality conformity determinations, greenhouse gas emissions, our disparate impact and disproportionate burden analysis, in addition to an integration of our performance-based planning practices, which you heard a little bit about today. Next slide. Over the next couple of slides, I will be summarizing some of the key feedback that we as staff received following the development of Destination 2050, in addition to some planned actions that we're proposing piloting in response to this feedback. The first major piece that I want to review was that there is a desire for the plan to go into further detail on actions that the MPO could take to support progress towards its goals, along with establishing accountability for this detail. This feedback emerged from many different sources, including public stakeholders, conversations that we've heard from you all in board meetings and workshops, in addition to staff discussions. Pretty similarly, we also heard that there would be an interest in participating in conversations that deliberate and identify priorities that fall within our relatively comprehensive vision, goals, and objectives. As a response to this feedback, staff will be piloting an approach for the next plan to explore some specific actions and strategies that we as an MPO could be exploring related to our goal areas. This can be further strengthened by developing performance metrics that are associated directly with our objectives to then track progress and trends in our goals over time. These metrics would align with our TIP scoring criteria as best as possible, and would be a larger process to establish. As we begin piloting this new approach, staff will return to you all to select 1 or 2 goal areas to focus staff time on. The ongoing Vision Zero action plan that staff are pursuing in relationship to the Safe Streets and Roads for All planning grant, is currently developing data resources and action steps that the MPO and partner municipalities could pursue to achieve our goal of 0 fatalities and serious injuries on our roadways. This would place us in a pretty good position to prioritize safety initially, as there would be a decent amount of data to support initial developments. Next slide. Next, we had heard from community groups and subject matter experts that we had engaged with throughout the development of Destination 2050, that they ultimately felt it was unclear how their input plays a role in our decision-making processes as an MPO, specifically related to the long-range plan. As a result of this, we've begun piloting a few different approaches. The first you've seen a couple of times already, which is our recurring updates to you all on content that we're hearing from engagement activities to make sure that you have enough time to respond to and consider what we are hearing from the wide variety of stakeholders that we're engaging with. Additionally, we're working to ensure that our approach to engagement during this cycle allows us to engage in some direct and honest conversations with our community stakeholders on where the MPO and our long-range plan do have the most room for impact. Next slide. We also heard some disappointment that the MPO was not able to incorporate scenario planning explorations into Destination 2050 to further evaluate the impact of alternative actions in future situations. During this development process that we're entering, we plan to conduct an exploratory scenario planning process to evaluate the effectiveness of various different strategies in an uncertain future. This process will be guided initially from input by engagement activities, including the 2021 discrete study that staff participated in called Big Ideas, which engaged a variety of stakeholders to evaluate various forces that could shape our world in 2050. To provide some further background on what scenario planning is, it's a practice that's often incorporated into long-range planning exercises. It uses modeling tools to explore future impacts of forces that can influence our transportation system. Ultimately, it's a process that can develop a variety of strategies in response to some different futures. And while it can be a very complex topic, many MPOs have had great success engaging subject matter experts and community groups, which will often lead to new voices and ideas entering into our planning conversations. Next slide. And the final bit of feedback that we received was that data from the needs assessment was not available early enough in the development process timeline to allow for decisions to be really truly deliberated. So in response to that, staff are currently working now to update content in our needs assessment, and we are hoping for an update before the end of this calendar year. Next slide. So as a result of this feedback, along with some best practices from other MPOs and DOTs in long-range planning, we do have a selection of pilots that we would like to be approaching our next long-range plan with, in addition to some new conversations. Some new approaches that we recommend include the regularly recurring engagement updates that we have been preparing for you all. In the future, exploring outcomes of our scenario planning exercises and taking a fresh look at the document and ensuring that it's easy to be understood by a non-technical audience. Another new approach that I would like to take this year is when we are reviewing our vision, goals, and objectives, that we take it from the lens of how the MPO and its staff can most effectively contribute to the progress of our goal areas. This will allow us to spend a bit more time discussing potential strategies the MPO could pursue, and we could draw some direct connections between our stated objectives and some performance measures to track our progress. Next slide. As an example of what this might look like, I want to just take a brief look at our existing vision and goals. The vision statement is defined as a comprehensive and aspirational statement for the region. In Destination 2050, it was established to read that the Boston Region MPO envisions an equitable, pollution-free, and modern regional transportation system that gets people to their destinations safely, easily, and reliably, and that supports an inclusive, resilient, healthy, and economically vibrant Boston region. From this large vision statement, we then define 6 separate goal areas, those being equity, safety, mobility and reliability, access and connectivity, resilience, and clean air and healthy communities. Next slide. Looking a little bit closer, each goal and associated goal statement outlines what the MPO aspires to achieve. Next slide. On the other hand, the objectives examine each goal more directly and can include specific actions that the MPO could pursue, some desired outcomes, along with listing investment and research priorities. Next step, or next slide. So while these objectives do go into further detail on each goal, they raise questions on how progress could be measured and what specific actions the MPO could be pursuing. Going into this next planning cycle, we'll be using Destination 2050 as a baseline for our conversations in order for us to have some more space to look at these specific topics. Again, focusing in on where the MPO has the greatest influence, identifying areas the MPO and its staff can directly impact our goal areas, and then employing our scenario planning practices to test the effectiveness of strategies, in addition to developing metrics that are directly attached to our objectives. Next slide. I also wanted to just take a moment to give you some examples of what some of our peer MPOs have been doing with their long-range plans. The Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission out in Philadelphia has developed a set of metrics to evaluate regional progress towards their goals in the form of a dashboard. They've identified various metrics to track regional success. They're monitoring trends for a variety of topics. This includes the topic of congestion through the lens of reliability on the regional highway system, transit condition through revenue fleet age, and transit ridership through trips per person, in addition to many other direct metrics. Next slide. Rhode Island's DOT took a slightly simpler approach when they were identifying strategies to influence goal areas. They also identified a couple of performance measures and tracked targets for each goal. On the topic of connectivity, they list strategies such as focusing on intermodal connections, incentivizing active and public transportation, identifying priority networks to support decision-making, and encouraging coordination between transportation stakeholders. Next slide. And earlier in this presentation, I briefly mentioned the need for the MPO board to identify a priority goal area in the future. We want to ensure as staff that when we're developing these new metrics and strategies, that we're developing ones that are methodologically sound and grounded in reality. This will take a bit of a process to establish, and we would like to focus our attention on one topic at a time. Currently, staff are working on the Regional Vision Zero Action Plan, which is developing a substantial amount of data analysis and actively engaging in conversations with regional partners on various action steps that could be taken. This puts us in a pretty good position to address safety from the get-go, leaving space for one of our 5 remaining goal areas to also be addressed at some point. Those being access and connectivity, clean air and healthy communities, equity, mobility and reliability, and resilience. In a few months, we're going to return to you with some additional information and context, and ultimately ask for a decision on which goal areas to prioritize during this long-range planning cycle. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to provide you all with an overview of what you all can expect for the next 2 years of conversations. Today acts as a starting point in our kickoff. Throughout the remainder of this fiscal year into October, staff will be working on developing content for our needs assessment, and simultaneously, in consultation with you all, we'll be revisiting the content of our vision and goals. Going into federal fiscal year 2024, we're going to move into more specific conversations on performance measures, strategies that we as an MPO could pursue, engaging in scenario planning exercises, in addition to beginning to look at our investment programs and regionally significant project selections. Next slide. And again, thank you all for your time today. This is an ongoing process. We're going to have many more conversations. I have a couple of sample questions to start conversation. I think most fundamentally is the bottom question: is there a format for conversation that you all would prefer engaging with in the coming years? In the past, staff have hosted a series of workshops for board members and the public. Is this something you would be interested in pursuing in the future? Do you have other ideas? And then when we return to you to start discussing vision and goals, it will be with the question of how have your goals changed since we last discussed them? And with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Erin. Any questions for Erin at this time? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is exploring the potential for using Conveil in Transportation Improvement Program project evaluations. Betsy Harvey Hertzfeld and Ethan LaPointe, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And well, it is afternoon now, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Betsy Harvey Hertzfeld. I am the Transportation Equity Program Manager for the MPO, and I'm going to be giving the presentation. Ethan, for some context, did help and had played a big role in this presentation as well. So we definitely coordinated on ensuring this kind of fits within his purview as the Transportation Improvement Program Manager. So with that, you can move to the next slide. So I'm going to talk today about the results of fiscal year 2025 UPWP study, which was titled Applying Conveil to TIP Project Scoring. Our report is slightly different, but it's posted on the MPO meeting calendar. We've renamed it to Exploring the Potential for Using Conveil in TIP Project Evaluations. The study goals were to test the destination access tool called Conveil to assess the feasibility of using it to evaluate how project changes access to destinations. We also wanted to run Conveil on a set of 11 sample TIP projects that represent the types of projects that the MPO funds to get a better understanding of the magnitude of the changes to access that we could expect from projects. And we wanted to use the results of these analyses to develop potential destination access criteria with which to evaluate projects proposed for funding in the TIP. Next slide. With the adoption, so I want to provide some background first, to put this in some context. With the adoption of each long-range transportation plan, as you may know, the MPO establishes new goals and updates existing ones. We as staff then update the criteria that we use to evaluate projects proposed for funding in the TIP to ensure that the projects that the MPO funds helps the MPO then meet those goals. Following the adoption of the most recent long-range plan, Destination 2050, staff identified areas of the project evaluation criteria that we could strengthen in order to reflect changes to some of those goals. For example, we added a new goal called Access and Connectivity, which was to provide transportation options and improve access to key destinations in order to support economic vitality and high quality of life. We also revised the existing transportation equity goal in order to focus more on eliminating transportation disparities, including destination access disparities. In addition, we have used Conveil in past work, just as a reminder. It's come to before the board a little bit in the past, but as a reminder, we've used it in our 2022 UPWP study, identifying transportation inequities in the Boston region. And we also use it currently to support the mitigation of disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens in our TIP. So these efforts have demonstrated Conveil's promise for analyzing project level impacts to destination access. However, those efforts have focused largely on looking at impacts for the entire transportation network rather than individual projects. And so as we move forward with this study, we wanted to focus on testing and better understanding Conveil's use for that purpose to ensure that it is the right tool for assessing how projects changed destination access. So that's the context and kind of how this study came about. And so I'm going to move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about Conveil and some of its benefits and why we felt it was a good candidate for analyzing destination access. As we've used it more in MPO work, we've gotten a better understanding of its capabilities and how we can best use it in our work. And we've identified several key strengths that we thought would really lend it to be a project evaluation tool. One is that it uses project data that are generally readily available to staff and project components. It also has a pretty fast processing time, which is important when we're working on a tight timeline to do project evaluations. It can be used to evaluate access for a variety of different transportation modes, walking and biking, etc., as well as for different demographic groups. It has a relatively easy learning curve, so we can build up staff capacity in that area. And it also can be used to analyze, compare impacts of individual transportation projects, as well as the impacts of an entire regional transportation network. So we did find that it worked very well for that purpose. We're looking at impacts for a large group of projects across the entire region. So an important part of the study was then to go local and really understand its feasibility for analyzing impacts at the local level and identify any drawbacks or challenges or areas for further investigation. Next slide. A significant portion of this study was focused on developing a methodology for evaluating TIP projects. I don't want to go too much into details because those are described in the report, but just give you a high-level overview of our approach and some of the key takeaways from our development of the methodology. To effectively analyze a project in Conveil, we need project information about which project elements are going to be included in the project, and particularly those that relate to the amount of time it takes to reach a destination, such as where a new sidewalk or bike lane is going to be constructed, headways or dwell times for a transit route, or the type of traffic calming elements that might be installed on a street. So we spent some time at the start of the study testing various project elements like these, as well as the impact of setting Conveil's built-in parameters and settings in various ways to get a better handle on how we should be using Conveil for this purpose. Next, to better understand the changes to access that could be expected from our TIP projects, we tested 11 previously funded TIP projects that represent a wide range of projects that the MPO funds across the various investment programs that we have. Based on our previous experience using Conveil, however, we decided not to analyze drive access or projects that only change make roadway improvements because of data quality and consistency issues. While Conveil can and has been used by other agencies to analyze large-scale roadway improvements, such as highway widenings, the MPO does not fund these types of projects. And the data required to model the types of local and small-scale roadway improvements that the MPO does fund have limited consistency and quality, whereas we have much better data on the type of projects that Conveil requires for bicycle and pedestrian and transit type projects. So that being said, not all projects that would be scored with Conveil would receive a score, but that isn't terribly uncommon among TIP criteria. A project may provide other benefits that are important to the MPO and the community it serves and get funded and due to those benefits that it provides. Additionally, we provide and will continue to have drive-related criteria under other kind of goal areas like mobility and congestion relief to ensure that we are giving importance to projects that provide those kinds of benefits to drivers. And our third part of the methodology was to develop a set of potential destination access criteria based on the findings of the analysis of those sample TIP projects. And I'll get to those findings in a moment. We wanted to use those as a starting point that we could test further and refine. And for reasons I'll get to momentarily, we're not recommending that they're being used nor have they been used in current scoring for the TIP we're developing now, but rather that we use them as a jumping off point to conduct a second round of testing by staff before proposing a final set of criteria for next year. Next slide. And now to the results. We analyzed access to 5 different destinations, which we paired with different travel modes: access to jobs, transit and bike, walk or roll trips, access to healthcare by transit trips, access to parks by bike, walk or roll trips, and essential places by bike, walk or roll trips. Those are metrics that we've used in the past that we're very familiar with, used in other projects that I mentioned earlier. And so that's kind of was our rationale in picking those types of destinations, as well as we continue to believe that they are important indicators of kind of quality of life. For each of these metrics, we calculated the per person % change in access for the entire Boston region. And so that represents the average change in access, which allows us to compare projects regardless of their size. And so because we looked at that region-wide impact of each project rather than at a smaller kind of project area analysis, the % change in access you'll see on the next slide is quite small. And so as we go through those results, just bear in mind that those averages are averages for the entire region, but actually in many cases represent significant changes for several thousand people. Next slide. So this slide shows the results for the 11 sample MPO projects that we analyzed, and they are anonymized, so we're not going to kind of call out any particular project at this point. We did not analyze projects for which criteria would not apply. So for example, we didn't analyze bike ped projects for transit with metrics that use a transit mode. So again, these projects are for the entire Boston region population. We saw a wide range of impacts, both positive and negative. In some cases, a decrease was identified in access. That often means, in the context of how Conveil analyzes projects and analyzes travel, is that the project slows down travel speeds. And we see that in some cases, that's the purpose of the project, which is to improve safety. And therefore that does slow down the ability of people to get through that project area. So again, it kind of goes back to the idea that some projects have other benefits that not just to kind of improve access, but also provide safety or other types of benefits. So conducting these analysis really allowed us to draft some test criteria that reflect the range of impacts that we would expect to see based on these results. Next slide. So we developed a set of test destination access criteria. Given the novelty of this process and methodology and some remaining questions that emerged from this study, we are presenting them as a test to demonstrate how project evaluation could proceed. As I mentioned, we are not using these in the TIP that's under development. Instead, we plan on using them in a further phase later this spring and summer, with staff presenting some more recommendations prior to next year's TIP. With that grounding, I'll explain kind of this initial set of criteria. We wanted to test, we wanted criteria that assess the impacts of destination access for each of the 5 destinations that I discussed a few minutes ago. We would develop a scale, such as the one on the screen, that gives points to projects that increase access to the region's population based on kind of the change in magnitude that we saw from the sample projects on the previous slide. So the scale would range from -1 for projects that decrease access up to additional 3 points if projects increase access, and kind of with points in between for kind of moderate changes in access. We would also propose, we would also consider giving negative points for a decrease in access for minority or low-income populations if we find that those populations be more adversely affected by the changes in access. And again, so we're planning on kind of exploring these in more detail and how this sort of approach would change project scores for all of the projects, each project in the TIP, so we get a better understanding of kind of, is this a sensible approach, or are there tweaks or changes that we should be making to better reflect project benefits? And next slide, please. And so finally, I want to wrap up with some of our overall findings, recommendations to summarize of what I've gone through. We've identified several outstanding questions that we think merit further investigation, leading us to recommend some additional work this spring and summer. So key areas we want to explore during that time is to evaluate impacts at the local level. As I mentioned, we looked at project impacts for the entire MPO region, which does make it easy to compare projects of different sizes, but it does mean we kind of lack that insight at the local level. And that's really, the local level is really likely to see the greatest change in access. And we want to better understand what those changes in access are, and if that might be another way we could score projects. We want to better represent bike share projects in Conveyal. We currently cannot model bike share expansion, but we are working with Conveyal staff in order to do so and hope to have that capability in the near future. We want to refine assumptions about how project impacts change travel speeds. Speed adjustments are really core to how Conveyal operates and is able to detect changes in access. And so we want to make sure that we're refining and improving our understanding of how different project elements change travel speeds and therefore access. And then finally, we want to compare project scores under the existing and test destination access criteria, so we get a sense of how scores could change, and so project proponents can understand, and the MPO board can understand what this change in criteria could mean for different types of projects, and be transparent about that. So that wraps up my presentation. You can go to the final slide, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments you have.
Thank you, Betsy. Questions for Betsy? Seeing none. Thank you. So wait, Lynn. I'm sorry, Lynn. No, go ahead.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course I do. And of course, if the advisory council still having meetings, I'd be begging you to come to one of the meetings. But I'm not going to ask a lot of questions now. I'll just state a comment. Is that I think this report is spectacular. Both in the way it's formatted, and the way the information is presented. I am going to have to reread it several times, and that's not a critique at all. I feel that anything worth learning is worth studying, and this is going to be very much worth studying. I do have a question, two quite quick questions, with respect to the scores that you give me for disadvantage, or I'm trying to come up with a good word, for having a negative effect on minority and low income populations. What if the population is minority but not but high income? How would you like maybe score that, or what value would you maybe apply to that?
Well, under the kind of proposed test criteria that's in the report, we would kind of do score it the same way as low income. So,
Okay.
but if that population group had were to have a decrease in access compared to the non-minority population, then the project could get a negative score.
Okay, and the second question, is about the fact that it scores across the region, and this is for a project, right? So you're talking about on the project level, but you're looking at the access scores, or values across the region, right? And you said that one of the things you take into account with these low percentages is that it's not evenly distributed across regions, so that a project, let's say done in Medford, will affect that population more higher than it would for those who maybe live in Lowell, well, the Lowell isn't part of the region. Maybe those who live in I'm trying to come with Brookline. Is that so? My understanding correct?
Yeah, a
Okay.
project is likely to have most impact kind of locally.
Right.
But larger project may have a bigger kind of project impact area versus a smaller project. And so there's a challenge in like setting the project area boundaries and what you should consider local, which is one reason why we went for looking at impact for the entire MPO region rather than at a smaller project area.
Okay, and last very last question. So the percentages you give, are there like ranges around those values? So like for instance, is it 0.0 2% plus or minus mean 0.00?
No, not
Okay.
not in the way that kind of conveyor does the analysis. They're not. There's no kind of error range or uncertainty range.
Okay, great. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Junro?
Mr. Chair, and thank you for this report, Betsy. I had one question. I was kind of curious about I was seeing in kind of the modeling methods for project elements, you noted that new sidewalks and new bike lanes were anticipated to have a decrease in adjacent roadway speeds for transit. And I think also drivers too, but that wasn't as relevant for the analysis. I was curious, like, is that a built-in assumption in Conveyal, or because I think my understanding is, certainly like the traffic calming elements are meant to calm traffic, but mostly like high percentile speeding, and that a lot of the delay happens at intersections. And so anyway, I was just curious if you could speak a little bit to that, or if that's something that maybe we could look into more to seeing are we seeing that play out? And is that something, because I wouldn't want to, want to represent model reality as best I can, but I just wasn't sure if that was a something that we have actually the data to say that that's the case.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I believe that it was an assumption that we made. I don't know if Tanner, if you wanted to speak a little bit more to it, he's worked more directly on the analysis part.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. That was basically an assumption that we made as part of this test run. I think there's definitely more research that can be done, potentially more data that we can look at to see if those same assumptions for like speeding drivers can hold the same way as bus, for example. So that was an assumption that we made to simplify the analysis. It's not a built-in assumption in Conveyal and can definitely be tweaked and researched more into.
That's definitely one of our goals for our next phase, is to look a little bit more into some of the assumptions and refine them as needed. So happy to hear any feedback, or if you have other data or information that would support this work. I'm happy to hear it.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is FY 26 to 30 TIP project scores. Ethan LaPointe.
Right, thank you very much. So as part of this presentation, I'll be discussing and pivoting back to the development of the federal fiscal years 2026 to 30 TIP for a moment, namely focusing on new project applications seeking funding there instead of currently programmed projects on the TIP. If we can go on to the next slide, I'll just sort of go through a run of the show on what this presentation includes, starting out with some of the meeting materials, which are currently posted on the MPO calendar for reference, give some context on what the scoring situation has looked like both this year, how it compares to prior years. I'll then go very briefly through the new project scores by investment program by project and summarize them. In prior years of doing this presentation, MPO staff have given a little bit more detail on each of the individual projects here due to increases in project application volumes this year, and also some rescoring items I want to mention at the tail end of this presentation. We don't have the full time to go in depth here, but worry not, we'll be talking about scoring more at next week's TIP committee meeting. And these scoring presentations or materials that I'll be mentioning will also be provided and circulated to MPO members at the March 20th MPO meeting as well. If we can go on to the next slide, moving into meeting materials. We have two different items for reference here on the MPO calendar. The first on the next slide is the traditional TIP scoring summary, table, and overview. This is available on the MPO calendar. It shows not only the overall score for each of the projects that are newly under evaluation this year, but also illustrates the breakdown by MPO vision and goal area by project as well. On the next slide, we then have project descriptions. This provides an additional level of detail versus what is available in this presentation here, though this presentation covers some of it. So while I may be just mentioning the projects in this presentation, if you want to learn more about their scopes of work, their cost estimates, budgets, scores, you can refer to this project description. This presentation is going to move in the same order as this project description sheet. So with that, just some context setting on the next slide, and I believe the one after that. So TIP project scoring is meant to be a metric that aligns the TIP towards the MPO vision goals and objectives that are set forth by the LRTP, which my colleague Erin McGuire just sort of laid out. The idea here is that the MPO's own transportation evaluation criteria for the TIP evaluation is also complementary to MassDOT's own evaluation process conducted through its project review committee. It is meant to just align a little bit more closely to the regional context versus the statewide context. On that next slide, if we can go over to there, the project application process and volumes prior to this TIP development cycle had seen a fairly continuous decline, moving from the 2021 to 25 TIP to 2025 to 29 TIP. This year marks a substantial reversal in that trend, going up to 10 projects across each of the core investment programs. When I say core investment program, I mean complete streets, bike and ped, and intersection improvements. And this breakdown is 3 projects for bike ped projects, 6 projects in the complete streets category, and 1 intersection improvement project. Among those 6 complete streets projects, it's worth noting that one of these is a subsection of a larger major infrastructure project currently listed in the MPO's long-range plan. And again, this is 10 projects total in the core programs, which is greater than the 3 or 4 projects that MPO staff saw last year. One of those 4 projects was a substantially late application. If we can go on the next slide, it's worth noting that this application increase is also marked by further increases elsewhere. Namely, despite a slight lessening of the Community Connections Program applications from 10 last year to 7 this year, a very substantial increase in transit transformation applications this year. I'll explain more on that at the end of this presentation, but this is largely thanks to process improvements that have been enacted at the MPO with our transit partners. With that, if we can go on to the next slide, I'll then start going in project by project here. And again, the project descriptions that are available on the MPO calendar provide more detail as scopes of work here. I'm also happy to not only answer questions at the end of this presentation, but also meet with MPO members one-on-one about these projects, or connect members with the project proponents directly as needed. Just want to lay that out up front if it seems like I'm going kind of fast here. So on the next slide, just going alphabetically here, we do have the highest scoring project across each of the projects under evaluation for this year. This is in the city of Cambridge for the construction of the bridge and shared use path connection over the MBTA's Fitchburg line at the Dennehy Park connector. Some MPO members may remember this project had initially reached out last year for design pilot funding, but received a Reconnecting Communities grant award for design, and the city is applying for construction funding this year. The next project is in the town of Concord. On the next slide, this one is a similar project as well, seeking a multi-use trail and bridge construction over the Assabet River near the MBTA Fitchburg line. And I should also note, near West Concord commuter rail station as well, with additional connections to the Bruce Freeman. On the next slide is a project that builds upon a previously funded MPO project to some extent. The proponent for this project is Newton, but it does span into Needham as well. This is the bridge replacement on Christina Street. This is also a collaborative effort as part of the Department of Conservation and Recreation's Blue Heron Trail as well. Moving on, that takes us from our construction projects for bike and ped. We'll then move into complete streets projects, starting off with, on the next slide, the town of Bolton for the reconstruction of Route 117 Main Street from John Powers to Mechanic Street. This also includes a culvert replacement, a fairly substantial culvert replacement here as well. And on the next slide, we then have a project request from the city of Everett, which goes, I believe, right up to the border of the city of Chelsea. This is the reconstruction of Vine Street and 3rd Street, and also from Chelsea Street to 2nd Street. The next project on the next slide is the one I mentioned earlier, which is listed on the MPO's long-range transportation plan. This is the second highest scoring project of the ones that MPO staff have evaluated. This is from the town of Lexington for the roadway reconstruction on Hartwell Avenue and Bedford Street. It's worth noting this map that's on screen here is actually inaccurate. It does accurately depict the limits of the project along Hartwell Avenue. However, the town has included an additional section of Bedford Street all the way up to the Bedford town line. So the limits are larger than what is depicted here. Also worth noting, the larger LRTP project not only includes this corridor, but also the Route 4 225 interchange at Interstate 95 and Wood Street as well. On the next slide, we then have an application from the city of Melrose for the, I'm sorry, I jumped a slide here on my reference. We have one from the town of Marblehead for the Village Street Bridge Replacement Project, which is over the planned alignment for the Marblehead Rail Trail. And on the next slide, we then get to the one that I jumped the gun on for the city of Melrose for the Lebanon Street Improvement Project from Lynn Street to the Malden City line. And last but not least, for complete streets, we have another continuation of an MPO-funded project, one that was actually alluded to during the MPO's annual meeting. This is the reconstruction of Highland Avenue in the town of Needham from Webster Street to Great Plain Avenue. And it's also worth noting this project is complementary to a Safe Streets and Roads for All pilot grant along Great Plain Avenue that the town of Needham was recently awarded, and is also near to several MBTA commuter rail stations in Needham. Lastly, we have one project in the intersection improvement program. If we can go from the next slide and the one after that. This is in the town of Wenham, which is working with MassDOT District 4 on some safety improvements along Route 1A. Also just worth noting here, this project has been in development for a fair bit and actually has a 75% design on it. And if we can then go into the transit transformation projects on the next slide, rather than list each of them out individually here, again, I will reference members to the project descriptions handout. We've listed all of the different projects that MPO staff have received applications for here. Starting off with the automatic passenger counting and vehicle location project. This one was included in Amendment 10, which was presented earlier. Next being the operational safety improvements funding request by the MBTA for the Better Bus Project bus stops implementation, focusing on the bus 714 and 716 routes. The bus priority and accessibility improvements request from the MBTA. Again, the $1 million included within Amendment 10 is part of a much larger request overall that the MBTA is making. This is reflected on the scoring summary sheet that is available to MPO members. And Amendment 10 also addressed the Natick Center station accessibility improvements listed here on this slide. For a project that was not included in Amendment 10, the next is the rail modernization early action items for the Beverly Depot grade crossing elimination. This is a pedestrian grade crossing within Beverly Depot Station on the Newburyport-Rockport line for headway frequency improvements. And on the next slide, just moving back into the projects that are in Amendment 10 again, are the Wellesley Square station upgrades for the Wellesley Square commuter rail for $5 million. A larger scale project for the West Broadway duct bank replacement. This is a focus on a utility overhaul project for the MBTA, focusing on cables and duct banks that support red and green line service throughout the MBTA system. And their catamaran overhaul project, already mentioned as part of Amendment 10. The MWRTA's funding request for compressed natural gas vehicle procurement for their 29-foot GILIG request, and the accessible redesign funding request as well. Now, these were the scored projects in the Transit Transformation Program. At the end of this presentation, I'll mention that there were a few projects that MPO staff either did not have sufficient detail or information to fully score. But moving on now on the next slide, just into community connections to kind of begin wrapping up with the newly scored projects. MPO staff received 5 funding requests within bike share capital projects, 3 for station replacement and 2 for station expansion. Overall, between the expansion and replacement efforts, there are 33 Blue Bikes bike share stations and 201 bicycles slated for either new implementation, replacement, and procurement. These projects are in the city of Boston, town of Brookline, city of Cambridge, city of Chelsea, and city of Somerville. The expansion projects are in Brookline and Chelsea. The replacement projects are Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville. On the next slide, we then have 2 bike rack projects, rounding out our 7 applications to the Community Connections program in total. The first is from the town of Marblehead for 22 racks with 117 spaces between them for about $6,200. and the other from the city of Newton for a joint request between several different types of materials for bicycle racks, bicycle shelters, and rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or RRFBs. That is 67 racks, 2 shelters, and 12 RRFBs for $473,000 across various locations in the city. Now, on the next slide, that was a whole lot of projects I just went through very quickly. Some key takeaways here, and again, we're happy to discuss this further at the TIP committee meeting next week. Municipalities, based on the increase in project application volumes this year, do appear to be making much more progress in advancing new projects following some of the disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not only reflected in municipal application volumes, but also the dialogue that MPO staff have had with these proponents. Most of the projects that are incorporated in this scoring summary are utilizing revised cost estimates as these projects rapidly approach 25% design over the coming quarters. Some of these may not reach 25% design until next year. Others may reach it before this TIP takes effect October 1st of 2025. Also worth noting that because of some of the earlier communication and coordination between MassDOT staff and MPO staff regarding project cost and readiness risks in autumn and winter, this allowed MPO staff to better project anticipated funding surpluses in federal fiscal year 2026 earlier for regional transit authorities and the MBTA to better shape application packages around and therefore do so earlier with project submissions. So when I said earlier that we received 1 transit transformation application last year and 12 this year, that wasn't due to lack of demand. It was simply because there was much more time to allow these proponents to provide those submissions. On the community connection side, there was a decrease this year. This is largely because microtransit pilot applications used to represent a substantial cross-section of the number of project applications that MPO staff used to receive. I believe in the 2024 to 28 TIP, there were about 13 applications to the program. So that overall application volume is no longer being buoyed by that and now largely reflects bike rack procurements and bike share investments, though MPO staff are continuing to work with project proponents and also communities in the region to identify ways that within the federal funding framework, more quick build and tactical projects can be supported by this investment program in the future to keep those application volumes high. So on the next item I want to just move into is something that MPO staff have mentioned a few times to this board and also the TIP committee. That is project rescoring. On the next slide, as we discussed at the February 20th meeting of the MPO, rescoring projects is the key crux of the TIP project cost change policies from 2021. The entire process for reconsideration is contingent on a project rescoring for any projects that this board would look to flag to make sure that with those new scores, a rescored project could be compared to other program projects or new project applications. This kind of rescoring process is ideally completed in a manner that is timely for TIP programming scenarios when we have to make decisions on the reevaluation of projects. It's helpful to have the scoring feedback before the scenarios are already locked in for a given TIP. On the next slide, to be upfront, most of the rescoring that was planned by MPO staff for this TIP cycle has not been completed. At the onset of this TIP cycle, staff had identified the need as part of the 2025 to 29 TIP development process to rescore a multitude of projects. Projects that were scored before the 2022 to 26 TIP had utilized an outdated criteria set that used a 134-point scale rather than the current 100-point scale. And of all of the projects on the TIP, there's 14 projects currently programmed that meet those conditions. Based on some of the repeated project delays of the last TIP development cycle, staff had developed a short list of projects proactively to rescore before the MPO board had identified specific projects to sort of allow MPO staff to get a head start before the MPO board would indicate specific requests. It's also worth noting, again proactively, there were a few projects on the TIP that had never been scored, and this rescoring exercise was meant to also provide those scores to them. Again, this rescoring exercise is still underway. I will be talking about this much more at next week's TIP committee meeting to explain precisely why this rescoring process was not able to be completed in time, what some of the headwinds are that staff are working towards or working against as we try to satisfy this request. But on these next slides, I will mention some of the projects that were initially flagged. And again, it is worth noting, these were flagged as a result of last year's TIP development, not as a result of the TIP readiness days exercise for this year. So on the next slide, there were 5 projects within the core within the category of projects for the 2025 to 29 TIP development cycle that were initially flagged for rescoring. And it's worth noting that all of these projects use that 134-point scoring scale that I mentioned earlier. This was the Boylston Street Improvement Project for the City of Boston, the intersection improvements at Route 1 and University Avenue and Everett Street in the town of Norwood, the resurfacing and relayed work on Central and South Main Streets in the town of Ipswich, the rehabilitation and rail crossing improvements on Cherry Street in the town of Ashland, and the roadway and intersection improvements at Woburn Common for the City of Woburn, based on discussions that came out, again, of last year's TIP development process, given the recency of some of the scores here. On this table, I've illustrated that many of these projects were first scored in TIPs up to 10 years ago, in cases of all 5 of these projects, over 5 years ago. It's also worth noting, again, just to reiterate, they're not using the same scoring framework the MPO is currently using, but they were each flagged last year. Among these 5 projects, only 2 of these projects were recommended for delay as part of this TIP. The other 3, Ipswich, Ashland, and Woburn, were not flagged for this TIP development cycle. And on the next slide, I mentioned unscored projects earlier. Based on time constraints due to last year's TIP development cycle, the MPO staff had not scored, but the MPO voted to fund in fiscal 26, designed for both projects that are currently listed on the MPO's long-range plan that are not yet funded for construction, at least construction in whole. This being the City of Framingham's preliminary design of intersection improvements at 126, 135, and the interchange component of the town of Lexington's broader LRTP project that I spoke about earlier. It's again worth noting that these projects were both funded as part of last year's TIP development. The third project that was not scored using the TIP evaluation criteria is the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue, which first appeared in the 2016 to 2020 TIP and did so utilizing the LRTP scoring framework instead of the TIP funding framework at that time. So with all of this in mind, again, we will be discussing these projects and also the overall rescoring process, objectives, and ways we can refine and make that process more efficient at next week's TIP committee meeting on March 13th at 1 p.m. The agenda for that should be coming soon, along with the meeting invite. If folks have any questions about these projects, I am happy to field them at this point, as I neglected to put a discussion or question slide after this one. So this is my final slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan. Any questions, comments, concerns for Ethan? So Ethan, I'll just ask a question. So I understand that rescoring hasn't been achieved. Is that going to be achieved?
In time for scenarios, very unlikely. MPO staff are hoping that given the substantial backlog of projects overall that are using an outdated scenario set, we can accomplish that over the coming months. Again, it won't be ready for programming scenarios, but as a larger body of projects is rescored over the coming months, it will make at least rescoring in future TIPs an easier process. This is the first crack functionally that has been made at trying to rescore projects. Admittedly, not a great initial showing, but.
And the rescoring, so you said also something about this isn't readiness days, this is something different. Is there a rescoring of readiness days delayed projects that's also going to happen in the coming months, or is that happening sooner, or is that not happening? Like, I'm just trying to figure out, like, what's the universe of TIP rescoring projects, and where do they come from, and why are we rescoring them, and when will you be done with the rescoring? And I understand you probably don't even know that, so forget that last question.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is actually something I had originally intended to cover in this presentation, but due to time constraints, we had to delay to next week. But the MPO or the TIP scoring process begins in earnest in early January, using applications and information provided by project proponents in the autumn. And because that whole identification and solicitation of project details and applications takes place before readiness days, MPO staff had to basically use last year's readiness days in a fairly almost guesswork manner, to be blunt, to identify which projects may come up again for this TIP cycle. The 5 projects that were flagged for rescoring were all ones that had not only been delayed in last year's TIP, but had also been indicated for delays in prior year TIPs as well. The idea as well is that by soliciting that list of projects in tandem with the new projects, the overall scoring process conducted by MPO staff is made more efficient rather than having one separate rescoring process for new and one or scoring process for new and then a separate rescoring process for existing. That is meant to attain efficiency given the heightened application volumes this year and also some of the other emerging readiness days problems and challenges that emerged. That rescoring process was disrupted. Something I'll also explain more about next week is that it is easier to score a new project than to rescore an existing project, as new projects send in applications and older projects often no longer have an application to be found.
Thank you, Ethan. Any other questions for Ethan? Thanks a lot. Next item on the agenda is summary of the FY 2024 public engagement activities and evaluation of program effectiveness. Stella Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. If we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. My name is Stella Jordan. I'm the Public Engagement Program Manager with staff to the MPO. I am excited to be here talking with you all today about the work that we've been doing in the Public Engagement Program and how we're evaluating our effectiveness and impact. I'll try to keep it brief. I know this has already been a packed meeting. Next slide, please. So over the past few years, as we've been building out the MPO's engagement program and practice, we've been developing processes for evaluating and reporting on our work. This includes, who we're engaging, what strategies we're finding effective, what we're hearing from engagement, and where there are gaps. And because that is such a broad range of topics to cover, we began with just annual program evaluations like this one today, to really dig into what types of engagement we're doing, what communities we're hearing from, how we are using input, and where there are gaps and opportunities for improvement. In the last year, we've also begun sharing quarterly reports, as my colleague Erin mentioned previously around the long-range plan. And those are really focused on what topics and themes we're hearing from the people that we're engaging with. But for now, this presentation today will focus on what we did and who we reached in the past federal fiscal year, or FFY, that is FFY 2024. I'll also discuss how we're analyzing and evaluating the effectiveness of our engagement work and highlight some ongoing goals for the engagement program. An accompanying memorandum has been posted to the MPO calendar for your review. Next slide, please. So the Public Engagement Program, guided by the Public Engagement Plan, or PEP, ensures that we as an MPO are meeting our federal public participation requirements by facilitating inclusive public engagement and transparency in our planning and decision-making processes. We, of course, also aim to go beyond federal requirements and be really proactive in making sure that we're providing truly meaningful opportunities for people in the region to get involved, and especially make sure that these opportunities effectively reach folks who we know have been historically underrepresented in transportation planning. Each year, we engage stakeholders throughout the development of the recurring development cycle of certification documents like the TIP and UPWP, as well as plans with longer development cycles like the LRTP. And we also support a variety of other initiatives and programs, which I will discuss more on the next slide. And just to briefly recap the engagement that we conducted in FFY 2024 specifically, the engagement program supported the development of the TIP, UPWP, and the next long-range plan, as I mentioned. But we also supported discrete studies, specific engagement projects, such as the pilot community planning lab educational program, engagement analyses like this one, the ones I mentioned earlier, the Regional Transportation Advisory Council, and the Vision Zero Action Plan. We've also supported several other MPO programs in areas of programmatic work, such as climate resilience and active transportation. And I'll just briefly note that while we are touching on some areas outside of core MPO activities, which the engagement program supports, like Vision Zero, the data analyzed in this memo in particular represents inputs from MPO funded work. But across all of these areas, we really seek to build and strengthen our relationships with stakeholders and communities in a consistent way and facilitate holistic connections sort of between and beyond the development of these specific plans and projects. Next slide, please. So one of the core parts of the MPO's engagement work is hosting and attending meetings and events to connect with stakeholders and members of the public, hear about their priorities, and share information about the MPO's work. In FFY24, we attended and hosted 30 in-person events, including street fairs, farmers markets, and community meetings, where we had opportunities to conduct interactive activities and connect directly with folks in the community. We engaged well over 1,000 individuals at these events. And we also prioritized attending events in communities that have not historically been well represented in the planning process. The map on this slide shows the geographic distribution of in-person events in comparison to the distribution of low-income people in our region. There are more geographic and demographic comparative analyses in the memo as well. Next slide, please. Our attendance at in-person events in FFY24 represented a substantial increase over the previous years, as we've been prioritizing more in-person and community-based engagement to supplement our digital-only methods. We also hosted more than 90 one-on-one and small group meetings with stakeholders in FFY24. Most of these stakeholders represented advocacy or community-based organizations, and this was also a significant increase over the previous years and reflects a lot of the relationship building work we've been doing. Next slide, please. Staff conducted 4 region-wide surveys in FFY24, and we received a total of 1,119 responses. The map on this slide shows the distribution of survey responses throughout our region by subregion. We see the lowest number of responses in SWAP and TRIC, so in future surveying, we will target engagement in these subregions to address this gap. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about other types of gaps that we're seeing as well. So to dig into demographics for a moment, our analysis of demographic data revealed shared by survey responses in FFY24 in comparison to the demographics of our region really reveals some significant gaps in representation from people with limited English proficiency, people with low incomes, people of color, and youth in particular. I will note that this was a relatively light year for surveying. In FFY23 and previous years, we conducted more surveys around the development of the Destination 2050 LRTP. And we did a lot of targeted engagement, which it does explain some of the discrepancies between the FFY24 and FFY23 demographics here. And I'll also note in the coming FFYs, we expect to conduct more surveying and regional public engagement around the development of the next long-range plan, which will give us new opportunities to address some of the gaps, both geographic and demographic, in response and representation that we've identified in FFY24. And throughout FFY24, in recognition of the underrepresentation of certain communities in digital survey engagement specifically, we did explore several other ways to address these gaps. So this included targeted engagement and surveying in underrepresented communities, including, for example, through a partnership with Union Capital Boston, through which we saw response rates for people with low incomes and people of color that were actually well above the regional averages, as well as attending meetings and in-person events and conducting hands-on community-focused engagement activities in underrepresented communities, like the ones I mentioned earlier, those in-person events, as well as partnering with community-based organizations to more effectively reach and engage with underrepresented communities. Next slide, please. So surveying, in-person events, all of these public engagement activities are supported by external communications. We use email and social media platforms to send timely communications about MPO work, solicit input, and share engagement opportunities. In the past couple of years, I'll note the utility of X and Facebook as effective communication platforms has decreased, while we're seeing LinkedIn becoming an increasingly important and impactful platform with, for our engagement with significant growth in FFY 2024 over previous years on that platform. And then we also saw continued growth in engagement with our emails in FFY 24, which is very promising. Next slide, please. So the MPO received 391 comments in FFY 24, many of which were prompted by our engagement activities and communications. Comments were received through interactive activities conducted at engagement events, shared during meetings, or sent to us via email or comment form. And these comments were shared by a variety of stakeholders, including municipal and agency representatives, advocacy and community-based organizations, and members of the general public. We heard from municipalities in every subregion, in part, I think, due to direct engagement with each subregional group, as well as general municipal outreach that we did. Comments from members of the general public, you'll see, are concentrated more in the inner core and in the areas where we attended in-person events and proactively solicited comments. So in this FFY and future years, we will continue to use these data to really work on addressing some of these gaps in representation through proactive, targeted engagement. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll also explore ways that we can bring some of this analysis into our regular updates on what we're hearing from the comments we receive, so that you can get a more full picture of the priorities of different types of stakeholders and communities. Next slide, please. In last year's program evaluation memo, we made several goals for the program in FFY 24. Many of these goals are connected to one another and also represent work that has or will continue to span across multiple years as well. So I'll talk through each of these in more detail if we go on to the next slide. In FFY 24, relationship building remained a core focus of the program. We built and deepened relationships with advocacy and community-based organizations through partnership activities and events, as well as through innovative program activities such as the Pilot Community Planning Lab. These activities allowed us to explore and test new strategies and methods, including different models of compensating and incentivizing participation. And they were also really important drivers for us in being able to more proactively and effectively address gaps in our engagement and connect with those underrepresented groups and communities that I've been talking about. Next slide, please. We also worked really closely with the Vision Zero project team in FFY 24 to develop and implement holistic engagement strategies for the Vision Zero action plan. We conducted research into peer agencies' advisory bodies to assess best practices for membership and meeting structure to inform the fifth goal here. And we also worked with the advisory council to develop a mission statement and goals for the group. Over time, this research and planning eventually led to a plan to implement the best practices, expand and diversify membership, and bring the advisory council into closer alignment with MPO planning cycles and input opportunities through a restructuring of the group, which began at the end of FFY 24. We are continuing to develop a new advisory body structure, which we hope to stand up later in the spring, and which we look forward to providing more updates on soon. And then finally, we planned for an update of the public engagement plan in FFY 24 to align the PEP with the current LRTP and really more accurately and comprehensively reflect our public engagement principles, practices, and policies. So this work also continues in FFY 25. And again, we look forward to sharing more with you later in the year about that. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little bit of time now just talking about impacts. I think it's always challenging to quantify the impacts of engagement and public input on the MPO's planning and decision making. But there are three areas in FFY 24 that I think really highlight how we've been thinking about impact. So if we go on to the next slide, the first area is one I've mentioned throughout this presentation, which is the work that we've been doing to better illustrate public feedback and connect input to planning outcomes through data analysis and reporting, and in particular, the quarterly reporting that we've been doing on themes and trends heard from engagement, which we hope helps to inform decisions, particularly around the development of the next long-range plan. Next slide, please. Another impact I want to highlight is the strategies for environmental outreach and engagement study, which I presented about back in December. This work really sought to strengthen our relationship with the environmentally focused work and stakeholders in our region and improve the incorporation of environmental priorities into our planning process. So many of the recommendations that we developed through this study centered on developing and improving mechanisms for meaningfully incorporating these priorities and needs into the process, particularly around the TIP and LRTP. This study also helped us identify new areas for the MPO to proactively support stakeholder work, including through environmentally focused technical assistance. And if we go on to the next slide, I think that the Community Planning Lab educational program also really exemplifies the way that we are working to create more opportunities and mechanisms for engagement impact. So we held the pilot Community Planning Lab at the end of FFY24 last September to bring together stakeholders who represent communities that are currently underrepresented in our planning process, with the goal of really building capacity for them to effectively advocate for their community's transportation priorities and needs. This involved deep dives into the LRTP, the TIP decision-making process, and program work to create a really solid foundation of knowledge about where and how community advocates can get involved and really maximize the impact of their input. Next slide, please. So as we move into FFY25, and this work is already well underway in many cases, we've set several goals for the program to continue building upon the work that I've discussed today. These include continuing to build and deepen relationships with advocacy and community-based organizations and stakeholders who are not well represented currently in our work. Continue to improve our qualitative analysis methods and information sharing structures to build transparency and address gaps in engagement. Implement the restructured MPO advisory body with a new membership and meeting structure and strengthened connections to MPO work. Develop more comprehensive engagement plans and strategies and begin focused engagement to support the development of the next long-range plan, and update the public engagement plan. And as I said, work is already well underway with many of these goals, and I really look forward to keeping you all updated as our progress continues. Next slide is my final slide, and I just want to briefly thank all of my colleagues on staff who have been involved in and supported the engagement activities I discussed today, both on my team and beyond, as well as the board for your consistent support of our engagement work and the program. Again, I look forward to continuing to work with you all in the coming year on really making sure that our planning process is informed by public engagement. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions and get us out of here on time.
Thank you, Stella. That's a very good presentation. And you did keep it at a good pace. Thank you so much. Are there questions for Stella? Lynn?
I beg forgiveness for everybody. I know it's 1 o'clock,
Oh, go
but
ahead, Lynn.
just a few short questions. Short answers is fine. I noticed that the youth was really, it's a shortcoming. It's hard to reach out to youth, but I'm wondering about like the next age range, maybe like the young adult age range. Do you have a sense of like the age range of the people that are coming that you're meeting when you go out on the road?
Yeah, I think it's a variety, and I will say we've had better success engaging younger people in general, not just like young kids, but I think what you're getting at, sort of mid-range
like 21
at
21 to 35.
Yeah. We have had better success engaging those folks at like public events, at community gatherings and things like that. And I think also through partnerships with organizations who work directly with them. So that's something that we want to continue exploring more.
Yeah. Because I think that's a real target, especially for the long range plan, because people in that age range are going to be living with our plans for a long time. It's really good, for them to be involved. And I noticed on the emails, it seems like you sent 25% fewer emails. We had about 8% more openings of those emails. What's going on there?
Yeah, good catch there. I could maybe have someone from my team who works more directly on comms speak to that. I don't know, Sean, if you're willing to speak to that a little bit. I think maybe we're trying to target our emails a little bit more, make them a little bit more interesting for folks to open. And so as we're expanding our email lists, we're trying to kind of refine the way that we're communicating a little bit as well. to
Okay.
make it more impactful.
And just a suggestion, a couple of short comments. You might consider podcasts. I am amazed that they work, but apparently they do, and so I don't know, to an extent you have the bandwidth, so maybe you can get some old members of the advisory council, get around and talk MPO. Just put it out there. And the last couple of comments is that I do support Jim's suggestion that maybe engaging people around the congestion pricing study might be a good way to generate interest, but also get some ideas from people as to what they think would work. And lastly, I just want to thank Erin McGuire for her presentation on the LRTP. I didn't want to slow things down because I wanted you to finish, but I thought her presentation on that was really good. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any other questions for Stella? Seeing none, thank you, Stella, and everybody else who contributed to this report. It was really well done. Next up is member items. Are there any? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? Please state your name for the record. Lynn Diggins.
Leonard Diggins motions to adjourn.
Thank you. Is there a second? Jen Rowe.
And Rowe, I will second the motion.
Any objections? Seeing none, without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all for all your attention today.
It's a great meeting. It's a lot of fun. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.